My parents stood in my hospital room as the monitor beeped next to my shattered leg. I begged them for a simple loan of $7,500 to pay for an emergency surgery. Without it, I would be permanently crippled. My father checked his gold watch and told me he had just put a cash deposit on a luxury yacht. My mother smoothed her designer skirt and said a limp would finally teach me some responsibility. My older sister and her wealthy husband just laughed before walking out to catch their flight to the Maldives. Then my younger brother rushed in covered in motor oil holding $700 he got from pawning his only source of income. He had no idea that his sacrifice was about to trigger a chain of events that would make me a multimillionaire overnight and leave our arrogant family begging for my mercy. My name is Aliyah. I am 30 years old, and I work as a quiet data analyst for a mid-sized corporate firm in Atlanta. To the outside world, I was just a woman typing numbers into spreadsheets. Nobody knew that for the past 4 years I had spent every waking hour in my cramped apartment, coding a proprietary quantum defense encryption algorithm I called Aegis Core. It consumed my life and my bank account, leaving me with barely enough money to cover rent. But I believed in what I was building. I believed it would be my ticket out of the suffocating shadow of my elitist family. That belief was violently tested on a rainy Tuesday evening when a drunk driver ran a red light and smashed his truck directly into the driver's side of my tiny sedan. I woke up in the trauma center of Grady Memorial Hospital with a pain in my right leg, so blinding it made me gag. The emergency room was a chaotic blur of shouting nurses and glaring fluorescent lights. Dr. Harrison, a top orthopedic surgeon, stood at the foot of my bed, holding a clipboard with a grim expression on his face. I explained that my right leg had sustained severe nerve trauma and extensive cartilage damage. The bones were shattered in a way that required an immediate, highly specialized reconstruction surgery. The problem was the only surgeon available who could perform this specific nerve graft was out of network. My high-deductible insurance plan refused to cover the excess cost. The hospital required an out-of-pocket deposit of $7,500 by tomorrow morning to proceed. Dr. Harrison looked me in the eyes and warned me that if I did not have the surgery within 24 hours, the nerve damage would become permanent. I would be left with chronic pain and a severe permanent limp for the rest of my life. $7,500. It might as well have been $1 million. I had emptied my savings account just days prior to upgrade the server hosting for my algorithm. I had exactly $42 to my name. Panicking and desperate, I picked up my phone and made the one call I swore I would never make. I called my parents. My family is deeply entrenched in the wealthy African-American elite circles of Atlanta. My mother, Renee, is a 58-year-old socialite whose entire existence revolves around maintaining her status in organizations like Jack and Jill of America. My father, Calvin, is 60 years old and measures human worth entirely by net worth. Growing up, their affection was reserved exclusively for my older sister, Brianna. She went to Spelman College, married a wealthy white venture capitalist named Connor, and lived exactly the flashy, superficial life my parents worshipped. I was always the afterthought. The quiet, nerdy daughter who refused to wear designer labels or attend country club mixers. They arrived at my hospital room 2 hours later. There was no rushing, no tears of concern, no desperate hugs. My father walked in first, aggressively checking his gold Rolex, as if my shattered leg was severely cutting into his busy schedule. My mother followed wearing a pristine white silk blouse and an expression of pure annoyance. "I thought you were dying the way you sounded on the phone." "Aaliyah?" My mother sighed, refusing to come close to the bed in case the hospital smell ruined her outfit. "Do you have any idea how much traffic we had to sit through to get down here? I am supposed to be hosting the alumni charity luncheon in an hour." "Mom, I need help," I pleaded, gripping the thin hospital blanket. "The drunk driver who hit me was uninsured. My insurance will not cover the specialist. I need $7,500 by tomorrow morning, or I will never walk normally again. Please, Dad, I will pay you back every single cent with interest. I just need a loan." My father scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound that echoed in the small room. He crossed his arms over his tailored suit and said, "We do not have that kind of cash just lying around for your emergencies, Aaliyah." I just wired the down payment for a brand new Regal 42 fly yacht yesterday morning. You expect me to pull funds from my investments because you do not know how to manage your finances. I stared at him in disbelief and asked if he was seriously buying a boat instead of saving his daughter's leg. Do not use that tone with your father. My mother snapped, her voice turning cold and vicious. This is exactly why you are in this position. You are always demanding attention at the worst possible times. Maybe a limp will finally teach you some responsibility. It will remind you that actions have consequences. Just like that time you ruined Brianna's debutante presentation because you conveniently decided to have an asthma attack. You have always been selfish. Before I could even process the absolute cruelty of her words, the door swung open again. My sister Brianna strutted in draped in a cashmere coat, hanging onto the arm of her husband Connor. Connor was the epitome of a finance bro, always acting like the smartest guy in the room and constantly talking down to my family despite marrying into it. Wow, Alia, Connor smirked, running a hand through his hair. You really know how to ruin a Tuesday. Have you ever heard of bootstrapping? Maybe if you did not spend all your time on that useless computer hobby of yours, you could actually afford your own medical bills. Brianna laughed, a sharp, grating sound. Seriously, little sister, you need to figure this out on your own. Connor just closed a massive funding round, and we are leaving for a 2-week vacation in the Maldives tomorrow morning. I am definitely not spending my packing day dealing with hospital drama. You will manage. Get some crutches or something. They turned around and walked out. My parents followed right behind them. My mother gave me one last look of disgust before letting the heavy wooden door swing shut. I was left completely alone listening to the steady beep of the heart monitor. The reality settled over me like a suffocating blanket. My own flesh and blood had chosen a luxury boat and a tropical vacation over my ability to walk. Tears of sheer humiliation and despair streamed down my face. I reached for the call button to tell the nurse to cancel the surgery when the door suddenly burst open again. It was my younger brother, Trey. At 28 years old, Trey was the only other black sheep in the family. He had rejected the corporate path my parents demanded and opened a small auto repair shop. He was wearing his work uniform covered in dark grease stains and motor oil, panting, as if he had sprinted all the way from the lobby. Trey rushed to my bedside. Without saying a word, he reached into his oil-stained jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, crumpled wad of cash. He pressed it directly into my trembling hands. It is $700. Trey breathed heavily, wiping a streak of grease from his forehead. It is not the full amount, but I can call some guys I know and try to borrow the rest by tonight. We are going to get you that surgery, Aliyah. I looked down at the money and then up at his exhausted face. I asked him where he got this kind of cash so fast. He looked away, shifting uncomfortably on his feet, and admitted that he just sold his diagnostic scanners and his hydraulic wrench sets to a pawn shop down the street. He tried to brush it off, saying it was fine and he did not need them right now. A fresh wave of tears hit me. I knew exactly what those tools meant to him. They were his livelihood. Without those specific scanners, he could not diagnose modern cars. He had just crippled his own business to scrape together a fraction of what I needed because he loved me. I tried to push the money back into his hands, telling him I could not take this because he would lose his shop. He pushed my hands back, closing my fingers tightly around the cash. He told me I was his sister, his voice fierce and unwavering. He said he would figure it out and told me to just hold on to the money while he went to make some calls. Trey stepped out into the hallway to use his phone. I sat there in the sterile hospital bed, clutching the crumpled bills. The contrast between my parents' brutal rejection and my brother's desperate sacrifice ignited something deep inside my chest. It was not sorrow anymore. It was a cold, calculating rage. My parents and my arrogant brother-in-law thought I was a helpless failure. They thought leaving me to be disabled was a funny lesson in responsibility. They had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. I wiped my face and grabbed my laptop from the personal belongings bag the paramedics had brought in. I powered it on and opened my encrypted email server. For 2 years, Valerie, the ruthless female executive of one of the largest global tech conglomerates, had been sending me offers to buy Aegis Core. I had ignored every single one, determined to maintain control of my creation. But loyalty and independence were luxuries I could no longer afford. I found her direct mobile number in the email signature of her last offer. I dialed it and she answered on the second ring. Valerie, I said, keeping my voice dangerously steady despite the agonizing pain in my leg. This is Aaliyah, the architect behind Aegis Core. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. She told me she was beginning to think I was a ghost and asked if I was finally ready to discuss a partnership. I am ready to sell, I told her plainly. Complete exclusivity and full ownership of the algorithm. But I have conditions and they are non-negotiable. $18 million in cash and stock, a permanent seat on your board of directors, and I need a $100,000 signing bonus wired into my account within the next 30 minutes. Valerie did not even hesitate. The corporate giant knew exactly what my software was worth to their military defense contracts. She told me that if I could grant her engineering team immediate access to the source code repository right now, I would have the wire transfer in 10 minutes. She welcomed me to the board. I sent the access keys. 7 minutes later, my bank app chimed with a notification. $100,000 had just cleared. I hit the call button for the nurse. When she walked in, I handed her my debit card. Charge the $7,500, I said firmly. Tell Dr. Harrison to prep the operating room. I am getting my leg fixed today. As they rolled my bed toward the surgical wing, I looked at my phone. I was going to heal. I was going to take my $18 million, and I was going to systematically dismantle the arrogant, perfect lives my family valued so much. They wanted to teach me a lesson about consequences, but they were the ones about to learn what a real consequence looked like. My parents stood in my hospital room as the monitor beeped next to my shattered leg. I begged them for a simple loan of $7,500 to pay for an emergency surgery. Without it, I would be permanently crippled. My father checked his gold watch and told me he had just put a cash deposit on a luxury yacht. My mother smoothed her designer skirt and said a limp would finally teach me some responsibility. My older sister and her wealthy husband just laughed before walking out to catch their flight to the Maldives. Then my younger brother rushed in covered in motor oil holding $700 he got from pawning his only source of income. He had no idea his sacrifice was about to trigger a chain of events that would make me a multimillionaire overnight and leave our arrogant family begging for my mercy. My name is Aliyah. I am 30 years old, and I work as a quiet data analyst for a mid-sized corporate firm in Atlanta. To the outside world, I was just a woman typing numbers into spreadsheets. Nobody knew that for the past 4 years I had spent every waking hour in my cramped apartment coding a proprietary quantum defense encryption algorithm I called Aegis Core. It consumed my life and my bank account, leaving me with barely enough money to cover rent. But I believed in what I was building. I believed it would be my ticket out of the suffocating shadow of my elitist family. That belief was violently tested on a rainy Tuesday evening when a drunk driver ran a red light and smashed his truck directly into the driver's side of my tiny sedan. The impact was deafening. The sound of crunching metal and shattering glass echoed in my ears before everything went black. I woke up hours later in the trauma center of Grady Memorial Hospital with a pain in my right leg so blinding it made me physically sick. The emergency room was a chaotic blur of shouting nurses, rushing paramedics, and glaring fluorescent lights that burned my eyes. Dr. Harrison, a top orthopedic surgeon, stood at the foot of my bed holding a thick medical chart with a deeply grim expression on his face. He explained in terrifying detail that my right leg had sustained severe nerve trauma and extensive cartilage damage. The bones were completely shattered in a complex way that required an immediate, highly specialized reconstruction surgery. The devastating problem was that the only surgeon currently available who could perform this specific microscopic nerve graft was out of network. My cheap, high-deductible insurance plan through my data entry job absolutely refused to cover the excess cost of the procedure. The hospital administration required an out-of-pocket deposit of $7,500 by tomorrow morning to proceed with booking the operating room. Dr. Harrison looked me directly in the eyes and warned me that if I did not have the surgery within 24 hours, the nerve damage would heal incorrectly and become completely permanent. I would be left with debilitating chronic pain and a severe permanent limp for the rest of my natural life. $7,500. It might as well have been $1 billion. I had emptied my entire savings account just 4 days prior to upgrade the secure server hosting for my algorithm testing. I looked at my banking app on my phone and saw that I had exactly $42.15 to my name. Panicking and desperate, knowing the clock was ticking down on my ability to walk normally, I picked up my phone and made the one single call I swore to myself I would never ever make. I called my parents. My family is deeply entrenched in the wealthy African American elite circles of Atlanta. My mother, Renee, is a 58-year-old socialite whose entire existence revolves around maintaining her prestigious status in exclusive organizations like Jack and Jill of America. She spends her days attending high tea, wearing custom hats, and judging other Black women who do not meet her impossible standards of generational wealth. My father, Calvin, is 60 years old and measures human worth entirely by net worth. Growing up, their affection was a commodity reserved exclusively for my older sister, Brianna. Brianna went to Spelman College, joining the right sororities and rubbing elbows with the right political families. She eventually married a wealthy white venture capitalist named Connor and lived exactly the flashy, superficial life my parents worshipped. I was always the massive disappointment. I was the quiet, nerdy daughter who refused to wear designer labels or attend their stuffy country club mixers. I chose to study computer science instead of corporate law, and they never forgave me for being ordinary in their eyes. They arrived at my hospital room 2 full hours after I called them. There was no rushing through the doors, no tears of concern, no desperate hugs to see if their daughter was alive. My father walked in first, aggressively checking his heavy gold Rolex, as if my shattered, bleeding leg was severely cutting into his busy schedule. My mother followed close behind, wearing a pristine white silk blouse and an expression of pure, unadulterated annoyance. "I thought you were actually dying based on the way you sounded on the phone." "Aaliyah," my mother sighed, refusing to come anywhere close to the hospital bed, just in case the sterile hospital smell ruined her expensive outfit. "Do you have any idea how much traffic we had to sit through to get down here? I am supposed to be hosting the alumni charity luncheon in exactly 1 hour, and my hair is already getting frizzy from the rain." "Mom, I need help," I pleaded, gripping the thin hospital blanket with shaking hands. The drunk driver who hit me was completely uninsured. My insurance will not cover the out-of-network specialist. I need $7,500 by tomorrow morning, or I will never walk normally again. Please, Dad. I will sign a contract and pay you back every single cent with interest. I just need a loan right now to save my leg. My father scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound that echoed loudly in the small room. He crossed his arms over his tailored custom suit and told me that we do not have that kind of cash just lying around for my sudden emergencies. He casually mentioned that he had just wired the massive cash down payment for a brand new Regal 42 fly yacht yesterday morning. He asked me if I honestly expected him to pull funds from his stock investments just because I did not know how to manage my own finances and buy better health insurance. I stared at him in utter disbelief. I asked him if he was seriously telling me that he was choosing to buy a luxury boat instead of saving his own daughter's leg from permanent paralysis. "Do not use that ungrateful tone with your father." My mother snapped, her voice turning cold and vicious. "This is exactly why you are always in this pathetic position. You are always demanding attention at the worst possible times. Maybe a permanent limp will finally teach you some real responsibility. It will remind you every day that your poor actions have consequences." Just like that time, you completely ruined Brianna's debutante presentation ball because you conveniently decided to have a severe asthma attack right before her dance. You have always been a selfish child trying to steal the spotlight. Before I could even process the absolute cruelty of her comparing my current physical trauma to a childhood medical emergency, the hospital door swung open again. My golden child sister Brianna strutted in, draped in an oversized cashmere coat, hanging tightly onto the arm of her husband Connor. Connor was the absolute epitome of an arrogant finance bro. How was always acting like the smartest guy in the room, and constantly talking down to my family, using corporate buzzwords, despite marrying into our culture. "Wow," Alia Connor smirked, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "You really know how to ruin a perfectly good Tuesday afternoon." Have you ever heard of bootstrapping your way out of a problem? Maybe if you did not spend all your free time on that useless computer hobby of yours in your dark apartment, you could actually afford to pay your own medical bills like an adult. Brianna laughed, a sharp grating sound that made my headache worse. Seriously, little sister, you need to figure this whole situation out on your own without dragging us down. Connor just closed a massive funding round for his venture capital firm, and we are leaving for a 2-week luxury vacation in the Maldives tomorrow morning. I am definitely not spending my precious packing day dealing with your hospital drama. You will manage somehow. Just go get some crutches or something from the nurse. They turned around and walked right out of the room. My parents followed right behind them without a single backward glance. My mother gave me one last look of utter disgust, adjusting her designer handbag before letting the heavy wooden door swing shut. I was left completely alone, listening to the steady mocking beep of the heart monitor. The crushing reality settled over me like a suffocating weighted blanket. My own flesh and blood had actively chosen a luxury boat and a tropical island vacation over my ability to walk. Tears of sheer humiliation and despair streamed down my face. I reached my shaking hand toward the call button to tell the nurse to cancel the life-changing surgery when the door suddenly burst open again. It was my younger brother, Trey. At 28 years old, Trey was the only other black sheep in our entire family. He had completely rejected the corporate path my parents demanded and instead opened a small auto repair shop downtown. He was wearing his heavy work uniform covered in dark grease stains and motor oil, panting heavily, as if he had sprinted all the way from the hospital lobby to my floor. Trey rushed straight to my bedside, ignoring the sterile environment. Without saying a single word, he reached deep into his oil-stained jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, crumpled wad of cash. He pressed it directly into my trembling hands, wrapping his rough fingers around mine. "It is $700. Trey breathed heavily, wiping a dark streak of grease from his forehead, leaving a smudge on his skin. "It is not the full amount, but I can call some guys I know at the garage and try to borrow the rest by tonight. We are going to get you that surgery, Aaliyah, I promise you." I looked down at the money and then up at his exhausted face. I asked him where he got this kind of cash so incredibly fast. He looked away, shifting uncomfortably on his work boots, and admitted quietly that he'd just sold his primary diagnostic scanners and his heavy-duty hydraulic wrench sets to a pawn shop 3 streets down from his garage. He tried to brush it off, forcing a smile and saying it was totally fine because he did not really need them right now anyway. A fresh wave of hot tears hit me, but this time they were tears of profound heartbreak. I knew exactly what those tools meant to him. They were his entire livelihood. Without those specific computerized scanners, he could not diagnose modern cars. He could not run his business. He had just voluntarily crippled his own auto shop to scrape together a tiny fraction of what I needed simply because he loved me. I tried to push the crumpled money back into his hands, telling him I could not take this because he would lose his shop and go bankrupt. He pushed my hands back, closing my fingers tightly around the cash with a stubborn grip. He told me I was his sister, his voice fierce and unwavering in the quiet room. He said he would figure out his business later and told me to just hold on to the money while he went out to the hallway to make some desperate calls to his friends. Trey stepped out into the hallway, dialing his phone. I sat there in the sterile hospital bed, clutching the crumpled bills against my chest. The stark, sickening contrast between my parents' brutal rejection and my brother's desperate sacrifice ignited something very dark and deep inside my chest. It was not sorrow anymore. The sadness evaporated instantly, leaving behind a cold, highly calculating rage. My parents and my arrogant brother-in-law thought I was just a helpless failure. They honestly thought leaving me to be permanently disabled was a funny little lesson in responsibility. They had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. I wiped my face aggressively and grabbed my laptop from the personal belongings bag the paramedics had brought in from my wrecked car. I powered it on, ignoring the shooting pain in my leg, and opened my heavily encrypted email server. For 2 entire years, Valerie, the ruthless female executive of one of the largest global tech conglomerates on the planet, had been sending me relentless offers to buy Aegis Core. I had ignored every single one of her emails, determined to maintain total control of my creation and launch my own startup. But family loyalty and independent pride were expensive luxuries I could no longer afford. I found her direct mobile number in the email signature of her last aggressive buyout offer. I dialed it and put the phone to my ear. She answered on the second ring with a crisp, professional greeting. "Valerie," I said, keeping my voice dangerously steady, despite the agonizing throbbing pain radiating up my shattered leg. "This is Aaliyah, the architect behind Aegis Core." There was a sharp, audible intake of breath on the other end of the line. She told me she was beginning to think I was a ghost and asked if I was finally ready to stop playing hard to get and discuss a real partnership. "I am ready to sell," I told her plainly, staring blankly at the hospital wall. "Complete exclusivity and full ownership of the entire algorithm. But I have conditions, and they are absolutely non-negotiable. $18 million in cash and stock, a permanent voting seat on your board of directors, and I need a $100,000 signing bonus wired into my checking account within the next 30 minutes. Valerie did not even hesitate for a single second. The corporate giant knew exactly what my software was worth to their upcoming military defense contracts. She told me that if I could grant her engineering team immediate access to the source code repository, right now she would have the wire transfer completed in 10 minutes flat. She formally welcomed me to the board. I typed rapidly, sending the access keys through a secure portal. 7 minutes later, my banking app chimed loudly with a push notification. $100,000 had just cleared and was sitting in my available balance. I hit the call button for the nurse immediately. When she walked into the room, I handed her my debit card without a flinch. "Charge the $7,500, I said firmly. "Tell Dr. Harrison to prep the operating room right now. I am getting my leg fixed today." As they transferred me to a gurney and rolled my bed toward the surgical wing, I looked down at my phone. I was going to heal perfectly. I was going to take my $18 million, and I was going to systematically dismantle the arrogant, perfect lives my family valued so much. They wanted to teach me a brutal lesson about consequences, but they were the ones who were about to learn what a real devastating consequence actually looked like. The harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room glared down at me as the doctor delivered the news that would alter my life forever. I needed a $7,500 deposit by morning, or I would be permanently paralyzed in my right leg. Laying in that sterile bed, shattered and bleeding, I made the desperate choice to call my wealthy parents for a loan. My father walked in, checked his gold watch, and told me he had just spent his extra cash on a luxury yacht. My mother looked at my mangled leg with pure disgust and told me a permanent limp would finally teach me some responsibility. My older sister just laughed and told me to figure it out while she packed for the Maldives. They turned their backs and left me there to face a lifetime of disability. Then the hospital door burst open, and my younger brother ran in covered in grease from his mechanic shop. He pressed $700 into my trembling hands, confessing he had just pawned the tools he needed to make a living just to help me. What my arrogant family did not know was that their cruel rejection and my brother's desperate sacrifice were about to awaken a dormant empire. They thought they were leaving me broken and helpless, but they were actually forcing me to sell a secret project I had been building for 4 years. Overnight, I would become a multimillionaire, holding the power to completely destroy their perfect socialite lives and reward the only person who actually loved me. Before I dive into this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe that the best revenge is massive success. The nightmare began on a torrential Tuesday evening in downtown Atlanta. The heavy rain turned the slick city streets into a dangerous mirror, reflecting the vibrant neon lights. I was driving my reliable but aging compact sedan back to my small apartment after another exhausting 10-hour shift at my corporate data analyst job. My name is Aaliyah, and I am 30 years old. To my coworkers, I was just a quiet employee, processing endless rows of digital information. What nobody in my life knew was that for the past 4 years, I had dedicated every single second of my free time to a massive secret project. I was the sole creator and architect of a highly advanced quantum defense encryption algorithm that I called Aegis Core. Building this complex software had completely consumed my existence. Every paycheck I earned went directly into paying for high-capacity secure servers and top-tier hardware required to run my continuous diagnostic tests. I lived on cheap noodles and instant coffee, so I could afford to keep my digital dream alive. I had poured my heart, soul, and entire financial safety net into those lines of code believing Aegis Core would eventually be my escape from my judgmental elitist family. That quiet hope was violently suspended the moment I entered the intersection of Ponce de Leon Avenue. The traffic light above me was solidly green. I accelerated slowly, but a massive heavy-duty pickup truck came tearing through the red light from the crossing street. The intoxicated driver was speeding recklessly through the downpour. I barely had a fraction of a second before the massive truck slammed directly into the driver's side door of my car. The impact was a deafening explosion of crunching metal and shattering safety glass. The sheer kinetic force threw my vehicle across the wet pavement, spinning wildly until it collided violently with a concrete light pole. A sharp, agonizing burst of pain ripped through my lower body before absolute darkness swallowed my consciousness. I woke up hours later to the frantic, chaotic sounds of the Grady Memorial Hospital Trauma Center. My vision was extremely blurred, and a heavy feeling of nausea rolled through my stomach. The relentless beeping of cardiac monitors and the urgent shouts of busy nurses created a terrifying symphony of medical emergency. The pain in my right leg was completely paralyzing. It felt as though someone had driven a jagged piece of burning iron straight through my knee and down into my ankle. I tried to shift my weight, but my body absolutely refused to respond. A tall man wearing dark blue scrubs and a white lab coat stood at the foot of my bed. His name badge identified him as Dr. Harrison, a senior orthopedic surgeon. He held a thick medical chart and stared down at me with a grim expression that made my blood run cold. Dr. Harrison introduced himself with a gentle but highly clinical tone. He did not waste any time sugarcoating the devastating reality of my physical condition. He explained in agonizing detail that the blunt force trauma from the car crash had completely crushed the bones in my lower right leg. Even worse, the impact had caused severe extensive damage to the delicate cartilage and the major nerve pathways running through my knee and calf. The bones were splintered in a highly complex pattern that required an immediate specialized microscopic nerve graft and cartilage reconstruction surgery. The problem was that this specific procedure could not be performed by just any available doctor on staff. Dr. Harrison explained that the only surgeon in the state possessing the technical skill to repair this severe nerve trauma was an out-of-network specialist operating out of a private surgical center affiliated with the hospital. My heart began to hammer wildly against my ribs as the financial reality of the situation crashed down upon me. I had a cheap, high-deductible health insurance plan provided by my corporate data entry job. It only paid for standard emergency care and refused to cover out-of-network surgical specialists. A stern-looking hospital billing administrator wearing a gray suit stepped into the room shortly after the doctor finished his explanation. She held a tablet and spoke with a cold, detached professionalism. She informed me that because my insurance company denied the emergency coverage authorization for the nerve graft, the hospital required a massive upfront payment to proceed. I needed to provide an out-of-pocket cash deposit of exactly $7,500 by tomorrow morning to secure the operating room. Dr. Harrison looked me directly in the eyes, his voice grave and urgent. He explicitly warned me that the delicate nerve endings in my shattered leg were dying rapidly. If I did not undergo this reconstruction surgery within the next 24 hours, the severe damage would become totally permanent and irreversible. The bones would heal incorrectly around the dead nerves. I would be left with agonizing chronic pain, a severe permanent limp, and zero chance of ever regaining full mobility for the rest of my natural life. I would effectively be crippled forever. $7,500. The number echoed in my head like a cruel, twisted joke. It might as well have been $10 million. I had previously completely emptied my meager savings account just 4 days ago to pay for a crucial security upgrade on the external servers hosting my Aegis Core algorithm. I slowly reached for my cracked smartphone lying on the plastic tray table next to my bed. My hands shook violently as I opened my mobile banking application. The bright screen illuminated the dark truth of my financial desperation. My total available checking balance was exactly $42.15. I had absolutely no more credit cards left to max out and no wealthy friends to borrow from. Panicking, terrified, and realizing that the strict medical clock was actively ticking down on my physical ability to ever walk normally again. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and let a bitter tear fall. I picked up my phone and made the one single phone call I had sworn to myself I would never ever make under any circumstances. I dialed the number for my elitist wealthy parents, knowing exactly what kind of agonizing emotional abuse I was about to invite into this cold, sterile hospital room tonight. The wait for my family felt like an eternity of agonizing pain. When the heavy wooden door finally swung open, my father Calvin walked in first. He did not rush to my bedside or ask if I was okay. Instead, he aggressively tapped the face of his heavy gold Rolex, looking profoundly annoyed that my physical trauma was interrupting his evening. My mother Renee followed closely behind him. She pinched her nose and complained that the sterile hospital smell was going to permanently ruin the delicate fabric of her custom silk blouse. She coldly informed me she was already running late for her exclusive Jack and Jill alumni dinner. I swallowed my pride and begged them for the $7,500, explaining that the out-of-network specialist was my absolute only hope to walk normally again. My father let out a harsh, cruel laugh. He crossed his arms over his tailored suit and stated that cash does not just grow on trees for my sudden emergencies. He casually mentioned that he had just wired a massive cash deposit for a brand new Regal 42-fly luxury yacht that very morning. My mother looked down at my shattered, bleeding leg with pure, absolute disgust. She delivered a verbal slap that stung worse than my physical injuries. She said a permanent limp would finally teach me some real responsibility. She accused me of always demanding attention at the worst possible times, just like when I ruined my sister's debutante ball with a severe asthma attack. Before I could even process the sheer cruelty of my own mother's words, my older sister Brianna strutted into the room. She was clinging tightly to the arm of her white husband Connor. Connor was a loud, arrogant venture capitalist who always loved to talk down to our family, using obnoxious corporate buzzwords. He smirked at me adjusting his expensive designer tie and told me I needed to learn how to bootstrap my way out of this medical problem. He mocked my quiet data analyst job and said I should have worked much harder instead of playing on computers in the dark. Brianna chimed in with a sharp, grating laugh that echoed off the tiled walls. She announced that Connor had just booked them a first-class luxury trip to the Maldives, and she absolutely was not going to waste her precious packing day dealing with my medical drama. She told me to just get some cheap crutches and figure it out myself. Without a single look of sympathy, my parents and my sister turned their backs on me. They walked out of the room, leaving me completely alone to face a terrifying future of chronic pain and permanent disability. The door clicked shut, and a suffocating heavy silence fell over the trauma room. The only sound was the steady mocking rhythm of the heart monitor, tracking my escalating panic. Hot tears of profound humiliation and absolute despair streamed down my cheeks. My own flesh and blood had actively chosen a luxury boat and a tropical vacation over my ability to walk. The sheer weight of their betrayal crushed whatever tiny sliver of hope I had left in my heart. I lay there staring at the blank ceiling, realizing that I was completely entirely on my own. My leg throbbed with a burning intensity, but the physical agony was nothing compared to the deep emotional void tearing open inside my chest. I reached my trembling hand toward the plastic call button, preparing to tell the nurse to cancel the life-changing surgery and accept my miserable fate as a crippled woman. Suddenly, the heavy hospital door violently burst open again, hitting the wall with a loud thud. My younger brother Trey rushed into the room. At 28 years old, Trey was considered the ultimate black sheep of our elite snobby family, simply because he chose to be a blue-collar auto mechanic instead of a white-collar executive. He was wearing his heavy canvas work uniform completely covered in dark grease stains and fresh motor oil. He was panting heavily, his chest heaving up and down as if he had literally sprinted all the way from his downtown garage to the hospital trauma ward. Trey ignored the sterile environment and rushed straight to the side of my bed. His dark eyes were wide with genuine fear and deep brotherly concern. Without saying a single word, he reached his rough, calloused hand deep into his oil-stained jacket pocket. He pulled out a thick, messy wad of crumpled dollar bills and pressed them directly into my palm. He wrapped his strong fingers tightly around mine to make sure I did not drop the money. He took a ragged breath and told me it was exactly $700. He wiped a streak of dark grease from his forehead, leaving a messy smudge across his dark skin. He admitted it was not the full surgical amount, but promised he would call every guy he knew in the auto repair industry to borrow the rest by tonight. I looked down at the crumpled bills and then up at his exhausted face. My voice shook violently as I asked him where he managed to get this kind of cash so incredibly fast. Trey looked away, shifting uncomfortably in his heavy steel-toed work boots. He lowered his voice and quietly confessed that he had just run to a local pawn shop 3 streets down from his garage. He told me he had pawned his primary diagnostic computer scanners and his entire set of heavy-duty hydraulic wrenches to get me whatever cash he could squeeze out of the greedy broker. The absolute emotional weight of his confession hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. I knew exactly what those specific tools meant to him. They were his actual livelihood. Without those high-tech computerized scanners, he could not diagnose modern vehicles. Without those hydraulic wrenches, he could not perform complex engine repairs. He had just voluntarily crippled his own struggling small business to scrape together a tiny fraction of what I needed to heal. A fresh wave of tears blinded my vision, but this time they were tears of profound heartbreak for my loyal brother. I tried to pry his fingers open and push the crumpled money back into his hands. I desperately told him I could not take this cash because he would lose his auto shop and go completely bankrupt. I begged him to take the tools back before the pawn shop sold them to someone else. Trey aggressively pushed my hands back toward my chest, forcing me to hold the money. His grip was stubborn and fierce. He looked me dead in the eyes with a fiery, unwavering determination that completely stripped away my ability to argue. He leaned down close to my face and told me I was his sister, and my health was more important than any piece of metal equipment. He said he would figure his business out later, but right now we had to save my leg. His selfless love in the face of our parents' brutal rejection shattered the final wall around my heart. I clutched the grease-stained money against my hospital gown, sobbing uncontrollably as Trey wrapped his strong arms around me. The stark hospital room felt suffocating as my brother Trey pressed his last $700 into my hands. I had begged my wealthy parents for a $7,500 loan to pay for an emergency nerve graft surgery, but they flat out refused. My father Calvin chose to buy a luxury yacht instead, and my mother Renee told me that becoming permanently crippled would finally teach me some responsibility. My golden child sister, Brianna, and her arrogant venture capitalist husband Connor just laughed before leaving to pack for the Maldives. Watching Trey sacrifice his only source of income while our parents practically spit in my face flipped a switch inside my head. The crushing despair I felt just moments ago completely evaporated. What replaced it was a cold, highly calculated rage. My family genuinely believed I was just a pathetic broke data analyst who would be forced to limp for the rest of her life as a funny lesson in consequences. They had absolutely no idea that their cruel rejection was about to unleash a dormant tech empire. I aggressively wiped the tears off my cheeks and reached for the personal belongings bag the paramedics had brought from my wrecked car. My hands were shaking, not from the agonizing pain in my shattered leg, but from pure adrenaline. I pulled out my laptop and powered it on. For the past 4 entire years, I had spent every waking hour outside of my boring corporate job writing and perfecting a proprietary quantum defense encryption algorithm. I called it Aegis Core. The project had completely drained my bank accounts and isolated me from the world, but I knew exactly what it was worth. For the last 2 years, Valerie, the notoriously ruthless female CEO of a massive Silicon Valley tech conglomerate, had been relentlessly emailing me aggressive buyout offers. I had ignored every single one of them, determined to launch my own independent startup and maintain total control of my creation. But family loyalty and independent pride were expensive luxuries I could no longer afford to keep. I opened my heavily encrypted email server and found Valerie's direct mobile number hidden in the signature line of her most recent multi-million-dollar offer. My heart hammered against my ribs as I dialed the number. She answered on the second ring with a crisp, intimidating professional greeting. "Valerie," I said, keeping my voice dangerously steady despite the burning agony radiating up my crushed bones. "This is Aielea, the sole architect behind the Aegis Core algorithm." There was a sharp, audible intake of breath on the other end of the line. Valerie's corporate facade cracked just for a second. She let out a dry chuckle and told me she was honestly beginning to think I was a digital ghost. She asked if I was finally ready to stop playing hard to get and discuss a real lucrative partnership with her conglomerate. "I am ready to sell right now," I told her plainly, staring blankly at the sterile white hospital wall. "I am offering complete exclusivity and full intellectual ownership of the entire algorithm. But I have specific conditions, and they are absolutely non-negotiable under any circumstances. $18 million total valuation paid in a mix of cash and preferred stock. I also require a permanent voting seat on your board of directors. And most importantly, I need a $100,000 signing bonus wired directly into my checking account within the next 30 minutes. Valerie did not even hesitate for a single second. The corporate giant knew exactly what my uncrackable software was worth to their upcoming military defense contracts. The $18 million asking price was a total bargain for the security Aegis Core provided. Valerie told me that if I could grant her senior engineering team immediate, unrestricted access to the source code repository right now, she would personally ensure the wire transfer was completed in 10 minutes flat. She did not ask why I needed the cash so fast, and I did not offer an explanation. She simply formally welcomed me to the board of directors. I typed rapidly on my keyboard, sending the complex access keys and transfer protocols through a secure digital portal. Exactly 7 minutes later, my mobile banking application chimed loudly with a high-priority push notification. I looked down at the bright screen. $100,000 had just cleared and was sitting in my available checking balance. I hit the red call button for the nurse immediately. When the billing administrator walked back into the room, looking annoyed, I handed her my basic debit card without a single flinch. "Charge the $7,500 deposit in full right now," I said firmly. "And tell Dr. Harrison to prep the operating room immediately. I am getting my leg fixed today." The administrator looked shocked as the massive transaction approved instantly, as the medical staff rushed in to transfer me to a surgical gurney and rolled my bed toward the specialized surgical wing. I looked down at my phone one last time. I was going to heal perfectly. I was going to take my newly acquired $18 million fortune, and I was going to systematically dismantle the arrogant, perfect little lives my family valued so much. They wanted to teach me a brutal lesson about consequences, but they were the ones who were about to learn what a real, devastating consequence actually looked like. I parked my newly purchased but completely ordinary-looking mid-sized sedan a full block away from Trey's garage. It had been 4 months since the life-saving surgery that perfectly reconstructed the nerves and shattered bones in my right leg. Thanks to the exclusive physical therapy my $18 million bank account afforded me, I could run, sprint, and jump without a single ounce of pain. However, as I walked down the cracked concrete sidewalk toward my brother's shop, I deliberately dragged my right foot, scraping my heel across the pavement to fake a slight but noticeable limp. Keeping up the illusion of my physical vulnerability was absolutely critical to maintaining my cover. My elite superficial family still completely believed I was the same pathetic broke data analyst who had been forced into a lifetime of disability. They had not checked on my medical progress even once since they abandoned me in that hospital room. The dense, humid Atlanta heat wrapped around me as I approached the rusted chain-link fence surrounding Trey's modest auto repair business. The heavy scent of burning rubber and stale engine oil hung thick in the air. I stayed carefully hidden behind a towering stack of discarded tires near the side entrance, keeping myself completely out of sight. The harsh sound of a grown man screaming furiously echoed out from the open garage bay doors. I peeked around the rubber tires and felt my heart drop straight into my stomach. An angry, red-faced customer wearing a sharp business suit was aggressively jabbing his finger directly into my younger brother's chest. The corporate customer was absolutely irate, shouting so loudly that the veins in his neck were visibly bulging. He demanded to know why his luxury imported SUV had been sitting on the hydraulic lift for 3 straight days without any progress. He screamed that Trey was running a pathetic, incompetent operation and threatened to ruin the garage's reputation online. He yelled that any real mechanic could have run a simple computer diagnostic in 10 minutes flat. I watched Trey flinch at the harsh words. My brother just stood there wiping his dark, sweat-soaked forehead with a dirty rag. He was looking down at the concrete floor, taking the verbal abuse with a look of profound defeat etched deeply into his exhausted face. Trey quietly apologized to the aggressive man, his voice entirely devoid of its usual bright, confident energy. He tried to politely explain that he had recently experienced an unexpected major equipment malfunction and was currently forced to run complex engine diagnostics by hand, which took significantly more time. I felt a sharp, agonizing pang of guilt tear through my chest. It was not an equipment malfunction. Trey was failing because he did not have his high-tech computerized scanners or his heavy-duty hydraulic wrenches. He was struggling and suffering total humiliation from abusive customers because he had voluntarily pawned his most vital tools to pay for my initial hospital deposit. He had literally sacrificed his own livelihood to save my leg, and now his small independent business was actively crumbling around him. The wealthy customer finally snatched his keys off the metal workbench, spitting out one last nasty insult about blue-collar incompetence before storming out of the garage and calling a tow truck. Trey slumped heavily against a rusty toolbox, burying his face in his grease-stained hands. His shoulders shook slightly in the dim light of the shop. Standing there in the humid shadows, I instinctively reached into my designer leather purse. My fingers brushed against my smooth metal checkbook. With $18 million safely secured in my blind holding company, I could easily write him a check for $50,000 right now. I could walk into that garage, hand him the physical cash to buy back his pawned tools, and completely wipe away that look of crushing defeat from his face. My heart screamed at me to rescue him, but my cold, highly analytical mind slammed the brakes. I slowly pulled my empty hand out of my purse and took a silent step back into the shadows. Simply handing Trey a massive pile of cash was incredibly dangerous. If Trey suddenly deposited tens of thousands of dollars into his modest local bank account, it would absolutely trigger a massive wave of questions. Our greedy, status-obsessed father, Calvin, would inevitably find out about the sudden influx of money. Calvin would manipulate Trey, gaslight him, and somehow trick my kind-hearted brother into handing over the cash for some fake family emergency or phony real estate investment. Handing Trey raw money would not protect him from our parents' toxic financial abuse. It would only make him a brand new vulnerable target for their relentless greed. I realized in that quiet, hidden moment that my brother did not just need his old tools back. He did not need a temporary financial band-aid that our father could easily rip off and steal. Trey needed a completely impenetrable fortress. He needed something so massive, so legally secure, and so structurally powerful that our arrogant elite parents could never ever touch him again. If my family wanted to measure human worth entirely by commercial success and untouchable net worth, then I was going to turn the family black sheep into an absolute industry titan. I was not going to just buy my brother some new computerized scanners. I was going to build a sprawling, unassailable empire right underneath my father's arrogant nose. I turned away from the open garage doors, leaving Trey to process his tough day in peace. I knew the temporary pain he was feeling right now would be worth the monumental reward I was actively plotting for him. I walked back down the cracked sidewalk, maintaining my completely fake dragging limp until I was safely sealed inside the tinted windows of my car. I locked the doors, started the engine, and pulled out my encrypted smartphone. I bypassed my personal contacts and opened a highly secured digital directory connecting directly to the top commercial real estate acquisition firms in the state of Georgia. I dialed the direct line for a ruthless high-end commercial broker who specialized in hostile corporate takeovers and blind corporate acquisitions. He answered promptly with a smooth, polished greeting. I did not bother introducing myself by my real name. I told him I was representing a private holding company and that we had massive liquid capital ready to deploy immediately. I gave him a very specific and highly aggressive directive. I told him I wanted to purchase the largest, most successful chain of luxury automotive restoration garages in the entire southern region. I demanded he find a franchise with state-of-the-art, hydraulic bays, pristine diagnostic centers, and a completely flawless market reputation. I told him I did not care if the current owners were not actively looking to sell. I instructed him to offer whatever absurd amount of money it took to force a rapid cash buyout within the next 30 days. The broker sounded slightly taken aback by my sheer blunt aggression, but the promise of a massive commission check quickly smoothed over his hesitation. He eagerly agreed to start pulling the commercial property records and drafting the aggressive acquisition contracts by the end of the business day. I ended the call and tossed my phone onto the passenger seat. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, glancing one last time at the rusted sign hanging over Trey's struggling auto shop. My family thought they had successfully discarded the two useless failures of the bloodline. They thought they had left me crippled and left Trey to rot in his grease-stained overalls. They were entirely oblivious to the silent financial storm that was rapidly gathering just over their heads. 4 months evaporated like a heavy fog lifting off the Atlanta skyline, leaving behind a reality of absolute power. My physical therapy sessions were finished, and the microscopic nerve grafts had healed flawlessly. I no longer felt even a phantom twinge of pain in my right leg. But the true transformation was not just physical. It was entirely financial and profoundly psychological. I moved out of my cramped, dark apartment and purchased a breathtaking $4 million penthouse located in the highest glass tower in Midtown Atlanta. I paid for the sprawling property entirely in cash through a layered network of blind trusts. Standing in my massive living room surrounded by tinted floor-to-ceiling windows, I could look down on the prestigious country clubs and high-end boutiques my parents worshipped. To manage my new $18 million fortune, I quietly hired a ruthless team of aggressive wealth managers and corporate attorneys. They constructed an impenetrable fortress of shell companies and offshore accounts surrounding my money. Legally, I owned nothing, but functionally, I controlled everything. I spent several days replacing my wardrobe. I deliberately avoided the flashy, garish designer labels my mother and sister loved so much. Instead, I purchased sleek, inconspicuous garments made of vicuna wool and pure silk. These were quiet luxury items that cost thousands of dollars apiece, but looked completely ordinary to the untrained eye. I needed to remain invisible while swimming in an ocean of extreme wealth. Despite having more money than my parents and my arrogant brother-in-law combined, I made a calculated decision to return to my boring corporate data analyst job. Quitting my job and disappearing would raise immediate red flags. If my greedy status-obsessed father or my nosy sister realized I suddenly had money, they would hire private investigators to track me down. Keeping my mediocre $60,000 a year salary and holding on to my old desk was the absolute perfect unquestionable alibi. It provided an impenetrable cover story for my daily whereabouts. Every single morning, I drove my old battered sedan to the gray office park. I walked into the crowded building, forcing myself to drag my right foot across the carpet in a carefully rehearsed fake limp. I sat in my tiny drab cubicle staring at dull spreadsheets and listening to my middle management boss complain about quarterly quotas. My coworkers looked at me with deep pity, whispering behind my back about my tragic accident and my permanent disability. I played the part of the broken, defeated woman perfectly. I kept my head down, packed cheap brown paper bag lunches, and apologized constantly whenever someone accidentally bumped into my desk. They had no idea that the quiet woman sitting in cubicle 4 earned more money in daily compound interest than the entire department generated in a fiscal year. The real work began when the sun went down and I returned to the impenetrable security of my midtown penthouse. I would lock the heavy mahogany doors, pour myself a glass of imported mineral water, and boot up my highly secured personal server. As a condition of selling my algorithm, I had demanded a permanent voting seat on the board of directors for Valerie's global tech conglomerate. These board meetings occurred twice a week via heavily encrypted digital conference calls involving the most powerful billionaires and tech executives in Silicon Valley. I never attended these ruthless corporate meetings under my real name. I logged into the secure portal using only the initials AW, and I strictly kept my high-definition camera turned off at all times to further protect my true identity. I routed my microphone through a sophisticated audio modulator that deepened my tone and stripped away any recognizable vocal patterns. Sitting in my dark, luxurious office overlooking the glowing city, I observed the cutthroat corporate world from the highest possible vantage point. I listened quietly as these industry titans casually discussed acquiring foreign defense startups, destroying rival corporations, and manipulating global financial markets. I treated every board meeting like a masterclass in psychological warfare and absolute financial control. I absorbed their ruthless negotiation tactics and learned exactly how to spot a weak, bleeding company from a mile away. Valerie, the formidable CEO, quickly learned to respect the silent, faceless board member known as a W because my analytical insights always resulted in massive profits. While I was secretly directing international tech acquisitions and multiplying my massive fortune, my family remained completely oblivious. My secret burner phone would occasionally light up with messages from the family group chat. My father, Calvin, would send blurry pictures of his new boat docked at the marina, bragging to his friends about his superior investing skills. My mother, Renee, would complain endlessly about the floral arrangements at her latest charity luncheon, acting as if her superficial socialite problems were the center of the universe. My sister, Brianna, would post endless selfies showing off the diamond tennis bracelets Connor bought her to display his supposed venture capital wealth. Every few weeks, one of them would send me a highly passive-aggressive text message asking if I was managing to pay off my crushing hospital debt or if I needed them to recommend a cheap medical supply store to buy a better walking cane. They never actually offered to help me financially. They just wanted to remind themselves that they were socially superior to me. I would always reply with short, humble messages, apologizing for being such a heavy burden and assuring them I was managing my tragic situation as best as I could. Feeding their fragile egos was the easiest way to keep them completely blind to the truth. Reading their cruel, dismissive messages no longer brought tears to my eyes. The deep, agonizing sting of their betrayal had been entirely replaced by a profound sense of cold, detached amusement. My family thought they had successfully discarded a pathetic, broken burden. They genuinely believed they were standing on top of the world, looking down at me in the dirt. They did not realize the ground they stood on was actually the palm of my hand. I was quietly mastering the exact financial weapons needed to tear their pretentious lives apart brick by brick. I spent my evenings methodically analyzing their deepest financial vulnerabilities. I was not a victim seeking their validation. I was an invisible apex predator, patiently circling my prey, simply waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The perfect moment to strike finally presented itself on a quiet, rainy Tuesday evening, exactly 2 weeks after my previous board meeting. I was sitting comfortably in the dark, expansive office of my midtown penthouse. The sleek room was illuminated solely by the cold blue light radiating from my 3 massive computer monitors. My encrypted server was actively connected to the bi-weekly executive board meeting for Valerie's global tech conglomerate. I was logged in under my usual discreet, alias AW, with my high-definition camera permanently disabled and my audio feed heavily muted. Valerie was expertly running the meeting, navigating through complex corporate acquisitions and international defense contracts. She seamlessly transitioned to the final item on the evening agenda. She announced that a prominent mid-tier venture capital firm out of Atlanta was aggressively pushing to secure a highly lucrative, multi-million-dollar distribution partnership. They wanted the exclusive licensing rights to distribute the Aegis Core algorithm to private financial sectors. Valerie explained that the firm was extremely persistent, and the director of the fund was currently waiting in the digital lobby to deliver a brief live pitch to the board of directors. She clicked her mouse to patch the guest into our highly secure virtual conference room. A new video feed popped up on my center monitor. My heart completely stopped in my chest for a fraction of a second before a slow, cold smile spread across my face. The man sitting on the screen was none other than Connor, my older sister's loud, arrogant white husband. He was sitting in a flashy glass-walled office, wearing an overly expensive designer suit and sporting the exact same smug, condescending smirk he wore on the day he told me to bootstrap my shattered leg. I immediately double-checked my security protocols to ensure my camera was entirely disconnected and my voice modulator was actively running. Connor could not see me at all. To him, I was just a silent black box on a screen among a dozen other faceless corporate executives. Valerie introduced the board and invited Connor to begin his presentation. Connor leaned forward, adjusting his silk tie, and launched into the most obnoxious, patronizing business pitch I had ever heard. He utilized ridiculous, empty corporate buzzwords, attempting to project an image of absolute financial supremacy. He spoke to our board of elite industry titans, as if he was doing us a massive, phenomenal favor by simply offering to partner with our technology. He bragged extensively about his venture capital firm's supposed liquid assets and their flawless track record of unprecedented market returns. While Connor continued to stroke his own massive ego on the live video feed, I calmly moved my hands to my keyboard. I opened a secure hidden terminal on my secondary monitor. My fingers flew across the mechanical keys as I utilized my elite cybersecurity skills to quietly probe the digital perimeter of Connor's venture capital firm. The corporate firewall they used was an absolute joke compared to the military-grade systems I was accustomed to bypassing. It took me exactly 4 minutes and 20 seconds to completely penetrate their external security network and slip invisibly into their private internal servers. I bypassed their basic encryption and dug directly into their highly confidential administrative ledgers. I bypassed the public-facing documents and accessed the hidden offshore transfer logs and internal corporate balance sheets. What I discovered hidden deep within their private financial records was a terrifying and highly illegal reality. Connor's heavily praised venture capital firm was totally, completely insolvent. It was an actively sinking ship, silently bleeding millions of dollars every single quarter. He was not a brilliant financial mind. He was running a desperate borderline Ponzi scheme. The ledgers clearly showed him illegally moving fresh capital from brand new, naive investors just to desperately pay off the missing returns of older, angry clients. His entire corporate operation was a massive, fraudulent house of cards built on lies and fabricated profit margins. The walls were rapidly closing in on him, and the fund was literally weeks away from a catastrophic absolute collapse. The profound realization hit me instantly. I understood exactly why he was practically begging on his hands and knees for this exclusive Aegis core distribution contract. If Connor somehow managed to secure the partnership rights to my revolutionary algorithm, he could artificially inflate his dying company's overall valuation. He could use that falsely inflated corporate value to quickly secure a massive institutional bank loan and temporarily cover up his deeply illegal financial tracks. He needed my software to save himself from going to federal prison. I looked back at the video feed where Connor was finishing his arrogant pitch with a wide, predatory smile. He was totally, utterly unaware that the silent black box on his screen had just completely dissected and exposed his entire fraudulent financial existence. Valerie thanked Connor for his time and placed him back into the digital waiting room so the board could discuss the proposal in private. Several board members expressed mild interest in the distribution numbers Connor presented. I immediately typed a direct, heavily encrypted private message to Valerie on my tertiary monitor. I told her that the technology distribution deal was highly intriguing, but we needed to maintain absolute control of the narrative and the public relations surrounding the partnership. I instructed Valerie to officially invite Connor, his entire executive firm, and all of his top-tier VIP investors to our upcoming highly exclusive annual corporate gala next month. I gave her a very specific and ruthless directive. I told her to let Connor absolutely believe that the distribution deal was completely guaranteed. I told her to inform him that we would sign the final multi-million-dollar partnership contracts live on stage during the main event. Valerie read my message and completely agreed to the aggressive public relations strategy. She brought Connor back into the main virtual conference room. She formally thanked him for his presentation and delivered the news exactly as I had instructed. She personally invited him to the elite corporate gala and strongly implied that the partnership contract was effectively his to lose. Connor practically burst with arrogant pride right there on the screen. His chest puffed out and his smug smile grew even wider as he immediately accepted the invitation. He promised Valerie that his entire network of high net worth investors would be in attendance to celebrate the historic merger. The video call disconnected, leaving the boardroom quiet once again. I leaned back in my soft leather chair and let out a slow, deep breath. The deadly trap was perfectly flawlessly set. Connor thought he had just secured the ultimate financial lifeline to save his fraudulent empire. He had absolutely no idea. He had just eagerly accepted a golden invitation to his own spectacular public execution. The soft hum of my cooling towers was the only sound in the penthouse as I pulled the stolen financial ledgers onto my main screen. Connor thought he had just won the corporate lottery, but I was already dissecting the rotting carcass of his business. I cracked my knuckles and began running a deep packet inspection on the origin files of his most recent investor deposits. My custom decryption software sliced through his pathetic security layers, revealing the raw banking routing numbers. I needed to know exactly who he was stealing from to keep his sinking ship afloat. I sorted the incoming wire transfers by the largest dollar amounts. The top-line item immediately caught my attention. A massive $1.5 million cash injection had been wired into Connor's fraudulent holding account just 2 days before my car accident. I ran a trace on the originating bank account, expecting to find some naive angel investor. Instead, the routing sequence pinged a local Atlanta branch of a highly exclusive private wealth bank. My blood ran ice cold as the account holder's names slowly decrypted across my monitor. The names Calvin and Renee blinked in harsh green text against the black background of my terminal. My parents. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart hammering a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. I pulled up the attached contract documents that Connor had stored in his hidden digital vault. It was a highly illegal, unregistered promissory note. Connor had drafted a completely fabricated prospectus, promising my parents a guaranteed 300% return on their investment within 6 months. He had used fake market projections and stolen corporate letterheads to make the illegal investment look legitimate. But that was not the part that made my stomach turn. The source of the funds was listed on the second page of the wire transfer agreement. My parents did not pull this money from their existing stock portfolios or their retirement accounts. The document clearly showed a brand new commercial lien. They had quietly gone to a predatory private lender and taken out a massive secondary mortgage on the family estate. They had fully leveraged the sprawling generational Atlanta mansion that my great-grandfather had built from the ground up. That house was the absolute crown jewel of our bloodline, a pristine symbol of Black excellence that had survived decades of economic turmoil. My father, Calvin, always treated that property like a sacred monument to our family legacy. Yet he had willingly handed over the entire equity of that historic home to his loud, arrogant white son-in-law based on a few flashy buzzwords and a fake spreadsheet. I sat back in my leather chair, the cold glow of the monitors, illuminating the tears of sheer absolute rage welling in my eyes. The staggering hypocrisy of their actions crashed over me like a suffocating wave. My father had looked me dead in the face while I was bleeding in a hospital bed and told me that cash does not just grow on trees. My mother had stood over my shattered bones and coldly declared that I needed to learn a brutal lesson about financial responsibility. They had actively, deliberately chosen to let me face a lifetime of chronic pain and a permanent physical disability over a mere $7,500 hospital deposit. They had mercilessly mocked my quiet data analyst job and praised Connor's supposed financial genius. All the while, they had literally just handed over $1.5 million of our generational wealth to fund his pathetic criminal Ponzi scheme. They refused to save their own flesh and blood for pennies, but eagerly sacrificed their entire legacy to buy the approval of a smooth-talking scam artist. They wanted so desperately to climb the social ladder that they blindly handed their entire financial future to a criminal. I quickly downloaded every single page of the fraudulent loan agreements, the fake prospectus, and the illegal wire transfer receipts. I compiled the damning evidence into an impenetrable encrypted folder and stored it on a completely isolated offline server. I needed this specific ammunition to be untraceable until the perfect moment. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I systematically erased all digital footprints of my unauthorized access, leaving his compromised servers entirely untouched. I swiveled my chair around to face the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the dark, sprawling city of Atlanta. The glittering skyline suddenly looked like a giant chessboard, and I held every single winning piece. Thanksgiving was exactly 4 days away. It was the one mandatory holiday where my mother Renee demanded the entire family gather at the estate to project an image of flawless generational wealth. She always hired private caterers and invited select members of her elite social clubs just to show off the very house she had secretly mortgaged to the brink of foreclosure. I knew Connor would be there wearing his expensive suits and bragging endlessly about the massive tech distribution deal he thought he had just secured with my conglomerate. I knew my father would be pouring expensive bourbon and loudly praising his genius son-in-law. I picked up my burner phone and opened the family group chat. It had been completely silent regarding my medical recovery. I typed out a short, highly calculated message, informing them that my physical therapy was progressing and asking what time I should arrive for Thanksgiving dinner on Thursday. My mother replied almost instantly, telling me to arrive at 4 o'clock sharp and reminding me to use the side entrance, so my medical equipment would not scratch the polished hardwood floors in the main foyer. She explicitly warned me not to bring up my hospital debt and ruin the festive mood because they were celebrating Connor's latest massive business victory. I stared at her cruel text message, a dark, genuine smile spreading across my face. I replied with a simple promise that I would be perfectly behaved and would not ruin Connor's big celebration. The trap was now fully armed, loaded with explosive financial evidence to permanently obliterate their arrogant existence. The Thanksgiving dinner was a grotesque display of artificial wealth. I sat quietly at the massive mahogany dining table, wearing my perfectly tailored dark wool trousers and my iconic red-bottom Christian Louboutin heels. My mother Renee had spent the first 20 minutes of the meal staring at my shoes in complete shock because I was walking flawlessly without the slightest hint of a limp. She had immediately tried to gaslight me, claiming she always knew my leg was fine and accusing me of taking out predatory payday loans just to buy expensive shoes to show off. I had simply smiled and let her believe whatever twisted narrative made her feel superior. Now the dinner was in full swing and the tension in the room was suffocating. My father Calvin was sitting at the head of the table heavily indulging in a crystal decanter of $200 bourbon. His face was flushed, a deep dark red, and his voice was growing steadily louder and more obnoxious with every single glass he poured. Connor was sitting across from me, dominating the entire conversation. He had been aggressively bragging for the past hour about a billion-dollar tech partnership he was supposedly about to close. He acted as if he was the absolute king of the world, gesturing wildly with his fork and using ridiculous finance buzzwords that my parents eagerly swallowed up. My father leaned heavily against the carved wooden table and raised his heavy crystal bourbon glass high into the air. He demanded that everyone stop eating and pay attention to him. He loudly proclaimed that Connor was the absolute savior of the family legacy. Calvin slurred his words slightly as he boasted that thanks to his brilliant white son-in-law, our family was finally going to transcend local high society and become true yacht club elite. He looked at Connor with a level of deep, profound adoration and respect that he had never once shown to his own biological children. The expensive bourbon completely stripped away any remaining filter my father had. He puffed out his chest and loudly confessed to the entire table the exact financial secret I had already uncovered in the stolen digital ledgers. Calvin proudly announced that he had personally ensured our family's monumental success by handing Connor $1.5 million of the estate's equity. My mother Renee nodded along, vigorously smiling like a proud queen, as if leveraging the historic generational home for a highly risky venture capital scheme was the smartest decision in the world. Calvin boasted that the return on investment would be so massive that they would buy a second vacation home in Martha's Vineyard by next summer. He looked directly at me with eyes full of drunken contempt and stated that true wealth requires taking massive risks and trusting the right people. He explicitly told me that I could learn a lot from Connor instead of being a miserable burden who only brings the family down. I kept my face completely blank, carefully, cutting a piece of roasted turkey while the fiery rage simmered just beneath my skin. I shifted my gaze to my younger brother Trey, who was sitting silently at the far end of the long dining table. Trey looked absolutely completely exhausted. The dark, heavy bags under his eyes spoke volumes about the crushing 14-hour shifts he had been working at his failing auto repair shop. He was wearing a clean but heavily faded button-down shirt, and the faint gray shadows of engine grease were still deeply embedded in the calluses of his hands. He was desperately trying to keep his small business afloat without the vital tools he had pawned to save my leg. Hearing our father casually brag about handing over $1.5 million in cash to a scam artist while actively ignoring his own son's financial ruin was a brutal, sickening reality check. Trey just kept his head down, staring blankly at his plate and quietly swallowing his immense pride. My older sister Brianna noticed me looking at Trey. She set her expensive crystal wine glass down on the table and let out a sharp, cruel laugh that cut through the dining room. Brianna turned her full malicious attention toward our exhausted younger brother. She looked him up and down with an expression of pure, absolute disgust. She mockingly suggested that maybe when Connor's massive billion-dollar deal finally closes, they could throw Trey a few $100 out of pity. She told Trey he desperately needed the charity money to buy some new greasy overalls because his current wardrobe was an absolute embarrassment to the family aesthetic. Brianna cruelly announced to the table that having a dirty blue-collar grease monkey in the family was a humiliating stain on their pristine socialite reputation. She told Trey he should just shut his failing garage down and apply for a minimum wage job sweeping the floors at Connor's venture capital firm so he could finally learn how real business works. Connor chuckled loudly at his wife's vicious insult, wrapping his arm around her chair and kissing her cheek. My mother Renee simply took another slow sip of her white wine, totally ignoring the horrific emotional abuse her eldest daughter was inflicting on her youngest son. My father Calvin actually nodded in agreement, telling Trey that Brianna was right, and that blue-collar work was for people who lacked the basic intelligence to succeed in corporate America. The sheer absolute audacity of their collective cruelty made the blood in my veins run ice cold. My heart pounded a slow, violent rhythm against my ribs as I watched Trey quietly put his fork down and silently endure the devastating public humiliation. He did not argue back. He did not defend himself. He just took the brutal emotional beating because he genuinely believed he was a failure. Sitting there in that lavish dining room, surrounded by the sickening stench of fake wealth and real betrayal, I felt my final lingering ounce of familial empathy completely burn away into nothingness. They were eagerly celebrating their own impending financial doom while ruthlessly torturing the only person in the room who possessed a shred of genuine humanity. They thought they were untouchable elites soaring high above the pathetic struggles of me and my brother. They had absolutely no idea that the monumental tech deal Connor was blindly banking on was entirely controlled by the very same disabled daughter they were currently mocking. They did not know that I had already sent the highly confidential fraudulent ledgers to a secure offline vault, ready to detonate their entire world. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my face to remain a smooth, unreadable mask. I reached under the table and gently rested my hand on Trey's knee, giving him a silent, firm squeeze of solidarity. I let them laugh and drink their expensive bourbon. I let them enjoy their final Thanksgiving dinner as a wealthy family, because I knew with absolute terrifying certainty that by this time next month they would have absolutely nothing left. The sickening display of wealth and arrogance around the dining table required every single ounce of my self-control. I kept my hands perfectly still in my lap, refusing to let my fingers curl into fists. My brother Trey sat across from me looking completely defeated by Brianna's cruel comments about his greasy overalls. I wanted to tear the room apart, but I knew that a premature explosion would ruin the intricate trap I had meticulously built. I forced the muscles in my face to relax and arranged my features into an expression of wide-eyed, naive admiration. I looked directly at Connor, who was swirling the expensive bourbon in his crystal glass with a look of supreme self-satisfaction. I leaned forward slightly, acting exactly like the pathetic, desperate sister-in-law he believed me to be. I told him that his billion-dollar tech partnership sounded absolutely incredible and asked him to share more details about the massive deal he was closing. Connor practically glowed under my fabricated praise. His chest puffed out against his tailored Italian suit, and he flashed a brilliant predatory smile that made my stomach turn. He eagerly took the bait, completely unaware that he was talking to the actual owner of the algorithm he was desperately trying to secure. He leaned back in his heavy velvet dining chair and began to weave an elaborate, intricate web of corporate lies for the entire family. He boasted that the global tech conglomerate had personally selected his venture capital firm out of thousands of elite applicants. He claimed the top executives were practically begging him to distribute their new quantum defense software. He loudly announced to the table that the deal was entirely finalized and that the official public signing would take place next month at the highly exclusive annual technology gala in downtown Atlanta. My father, Calvin, slammed his hand down on the table in a burst of drunken excitement. He loudly proclaimed that attending such a prestigious corporate gala would permanently cement our family in the highest echelons of Atlanta high society. My mother, Renee, immediately chimed in, her eyes sparkling with shallow, materialistic greed. She began frantically calculating how quickly she could secure a custom designer gown and book an appointment with her elite hairstylist. She boasted that her country club friends would absolutely die of jealousy when they saw the photos of our family rubbing elbows with Silicon Valley billionaires. Brianna was equally ecstatic, already planning her red carpet entrance and discussing which diamond jewelry she would demand Connor buy for her to wear. They were all completely, entirely captivated by the grand illusion of limitless wealth and untouchable power that Connor was selling them. I let them revel in their pathetic social climbing fantasies for a few more minutes before I made my calculated move. I kept my voice soft and deliberately insecure, perfectly mimicking the broken woman they expected me to be. I looked at Connor with a highly exaggerated expression of awe and quietly asked if there was any possible way that Trey and I could attend the corporate gala as his guests. I told him that neither of us had ever been to a real high society event and that it would be a massive honor to simply stand in the back of the room and watch him sign such a historic contract. I laid the flattery on thick, telling him that Trey and I desperately needed a distraction from our miserable working-class struggles, and that seeing true corporate success up close would be incredibly inspiring for us. Brianna immediately scoffed at my request, nearly choking on her expensive white wine. She slammed her glass down and shot me a look of pure, unadulterated venom. She told me absolutely not, and loudly declared that a highly exclusive tech gala was no place for a crippled data analyst and a dirty auto mechanic. She whined to Connor that bringing the two family failures would completely ruin their pristine aesthetic and make them look like a charity case in front of the wealthy investors. My mother, Renee, quickly agreed with Brianna, stating that high society events required a certain level of sophisticated grace that Trey and I fundamentally lacked. She told me to just stay home in my cheap apartment and watch the news coverage of the event on television, like a normal working-class citizen. But I knew exactly how to manipulate Connor's fragile, massive ego. I kept my eyes locked on Ace, silently pleading with him, knowing that a narcissist like him could never resist the opportunity to show off his perceived supreme power to the very people he deemed deeply inferior. Connor held up his hand, silencing his wife and his mother-in-law with a single arrogant gesture. He looked at me and Trey with a deeply condescending smirk that made my blood boil all over again. He announced that he actually had enough elite executive pull to easily add two simple +1s to the general admission guest list. He told Brianna it would be a good charitable deed to let the less fortunate members of the family witness what real financial dominance looked like in person. He thrived on the idea of having a captive, pathetic audience to worship his fake achievements. Connor leaned across the polished mahogany table, pointing his silver dinner fork directly at me. He stated he would grant us access to the gala, but he laid down a set of highly insulting, humiliating conditions. He told me I needed to go to a cheap department store and rent a decent dress, so I did not completely embarrass the family with my usual boring wardrobe. He then pointed at Trey and explicitly ordered him to spend a week scrubbing the dark engine grease out from under his fingernails before he even thought about stepping foot inside a luxury venue. He demanded that we stay entirely in this background, not speak to any of the important billionaires, and simply watch him make history from the shadows. The sheer aggressive disrespect in his voice was staggering. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I reached under the table once again and gently squeezed Trey's knee to keep him from reacting to the vicious insults. I forced my lips to curve upward into the warmest, most genuinely grateful smile I could possibly muster. I thanked Connor profusely for his incredible, unmatched generosity. I looked directly into his arrogant, lying eyes and told him I completely understood his strict rules. I promised him in a soft, steady voice that Trey and I would absolutely not embarrass him in front of his wealthy investors. I assured him with a dark, hidden double meaning that it would be a spectacular night that none of us would ever forget. The deadly trap was now permanently locked, and Connor had just eagerly handed me the very key I needed to completely destroy his entire fraudulent life on the biggest public stage imaginable. The massive ballroom inside the Four Seasons Hotel was an absolute spectacle of excessive corporate wealth and unbridled arrogance. Enormous crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the crowded room, illuminating the elite tech investors and high society socialites of Atlanta. Waitstaff in crisp white tuxedos glided flawlessly through the room carrying silver trays loaded with vintage champagne and beluga caviar. My parents, Calvin and Renee, along with Brianna and Connor, were currently standing near the center of the main floor, acting as if they personally owned the entire hotel. They had secured a prime spot near the main stage, aggressively dominating the conversation with a group of wealthy Silicon Valley executives. Calvin was puffing out his chest, laughing too loudly at his own jokes, while Renee repeatedly adjusted her gaudy diamond necklace to ensure maximum visibility. Connor was holding court, swirling his drink and soaking up the artificial respect like a starving man. I stood quietly in the grand marble foyer just outside the main ballroom doors, waiting for the perfect moment to make my entrance. I had secretly taken my younger brother Trey to an elite master tailor 3 weeks prior, completely outfitting him in a bespoke midnight blue Tom Ford suit. The expert tailoring broadened his shoulders and gave him an aura of untouchable quiet confidence. Trey looked absolutely phenomenal, a stark, brilliant contrast to the dirty, grease-stained overalls our family mocked him for wearing. I was wearing a breathtaking custom-designed emerald green silk gown that cascaded perfectly down my completely healed right leg. The expensive fabric caught the chandelier light with every step I took. My hair was styled flawlessly and my makeup was sharp and precise. We did not arrive in a cheap rideshare or a basic taxi. We had pulled up to the front entrance in a chauffeur-driven black Maybach, turning the heads of every single valet and security guard on the property. Trey offered me his arm, and I took it gently, resting my hand on his tailored sleeve. We took a collective deep breath and walked through the heavy double doors entering the crowded ballroom. The sheer visual impact of our arrival was immediate. Conversations nearby naturally died down as people turned to admire my emerald gown and Trey's sharp suit. We slowly, purposefully made our way directly toward the center of the room where my family was obnoxiously holding court. Brianna was the very first person to spot us. She was taking a sip of her champagne, but suddenly froze, her eyes widening in absolute genuine shock. She lowered her crystal glass, her jaw dropping slightly as she took in my flawless, graceful walk and the undeniable expensive quality of our clothing. Brianna quickly recovered from her shock, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. She shoved past an older investor and marched directly up to me, completely ignoring the formal setting. "What in the hell are you two doing here?" Brianna hissed, her voice tight with furious embarrassment. She looked me up and down, her eyes filled with toxic jealousy. Did you max out another predatory credit card just to rent that dress, Aaliyah? You look absolutely ridiculous playing dress up. You do not belong here. This is an exclusive event for actual successful people, not broken data analysts and dirty grease monkeys. My mother Renee quickly rushed over to join the confrontation, her face flushed with extreme panic. She aggressively grabbed my arm, trying to physically pull me away from the crowd of wealthy investors. Alia, you are completely humiliating us, Renee whispered sharply, her manicured nails digging painfully into my skin. I explicitly told you to stay home and watch the news coverage. You need to leave right this second before Connor sees you and throws a fit. You are going to ruin his massive distribution deal with your pathetic presence. Calvin and Connor finally noticed the commotion and walked over looking profoundly irritated by our sudden appearance. Connor crossed his arms over his chest completely, looking down his nose at me and Trey. I thought I told you two to stay in the back and be quiet. Connor scoffed loudly enough for the surrounding guests to hear. You are making a massive scene. If you cannot follow simple basic instructions, I will have the security team physically drag you out of this venue. You are only here on my charity guest list. I gently but firmly pried my mother's hand off my arm, smoothing the silk fabric of my emerald gown. I did not break eye contact with Connor. I simply offered him a warm, highly calculated smile that held absolutely zero warmth. Oh, I promise you, Connor, I said, my voice carrying a smooth, dangerous edge that made him blink in sudden confusion. We will not embarrass you at all. In fact, tonight is going to be a spectacular night that you and my parents will truly never ever forget. Before Connor could respond with another arrogant insult, Brianna furiously turned around and actively started waving her hand in the air. She was frantically trying to flag down a nearby security guard in a dark suit. Excuse me, Brianna shouted, her voice shrill and demanding. These two people are crashing a private corporate event. They are severely harassing my husband, and they need to be immediately restricted to the general admission area. They are not on the VIP list, and they have absolutely no business standing in this section of the ballroom. The security guard immediately began walking toward our group, his hand resting cautiously on his radio earpiece. Connor smirked, looking extremely satisfied with his wife's aggressive behavior. Calvin and Renee simply stood back, actively allowing Brianna to have their own biological children publicly removed from the event. They were perfectly willing to let security humiliate me and Trey just to protect their fragile fake elite status. I stood perfectly still, maintaining my calm, pleasant smile as the tall security guard finally reached our tense circle. Ma'am, is there a problem here? The guard asked, looking directly at Brianna. Brianna pointed a sharp, manicured finger right at my chest. Yes, there is a massive problem, she snapped. These two individuals are harassing my husband, and they do not have the proper security clearance to be standing in the elite investor section. I need you to physically escort them to the back of the room right now before they ruin the entire event. The security guard turned his attention to me, politely asking to see my credentials. I did not say a word. I simply reached into my small designer clutch and pulled out a heavy matte black metal card. It was not a standard paper guest pass. It was a solid titanium executive board member credential stamped with the highest possible security clearance the conglomerate offered. I smoothly handed the heavy metal card to the guard, keeping my eyes totally locked on Connor's arrogant, suddenly confused face. The guard took the titanium card and quickly scanned the embedded microchip with his handheld device. The device beeped with a loud, bright green approval light. The guard's entire demeanor shifted instantly from cautious authority to profound, absolute respect. He immediately handed the card back to me and offered a deep, polite bow. I am so terribly sorry for the interruption, Miss Aaliyah. The guard said, his voice loud and clear for my entire family to hear. Your executive credentials are in perfect order. Please let me know if these other guests are bothering you, and I will gladly have them removed from your presence. The heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom slowly swung shut behind us, sealing the elite crowd inside the massive space. The ceiling was lined with cascading crystal fixtures that bathed the room in an expensive golden hue. Soft jazz played from a live orchestra in the far corner, while the most powerful tech investors in the city mingled around tables draped in black silk. My brother Trey stood tall beside me, his bespoke midnight blue suit catching the light perfectly. I guided him toward a strategic position near the front of the stage, keeping us just out of the direct line of sight of my family, but close enough to witness every single second of their impending destruction. Connor had aggressively pushed his way to the very front row, bringing my father Calvin, my mother Renee, and my sister Brianna right up to the edge of the podium. They were standing in a tight, pretentious circle, acting as if they were the guests of honor for the entire evening. I watched as Connor confidently adjusted his silk tie and puffed out his chest, looking around the room with a gaze full of supreme entitlement. He leaned over and whispered something to Calvin, pointing toward the empty stage with a smug grin. Calvin nodded vigorously, pulling out his expensive smartphone to prepare to record the moment his white son-in-law supposedly saved their financial legacy. Rennie was busy fixing Brianna's hair, completely oblivious to the fact that their entire world was about to violently collapse. The low hum of corporate chatter instantly died down as the main ballroom lights began to dim. A single bright spotlight illuminated the center of the stage. Valerie, the ruthless female CEO of the global tech conglomerate, walked confidently up to the acrylic podium. She wore a sharp-tailored black suit that projected absolute authority. The entire room fell completely silent, hanging onto her every word. Valerie tapped the microphone once and offered a perfectly calculated corporate smile to the sea of wealthy investors. She welcomed everyone to the annual technology gala and thanked them for their continued dedication to the future of digital security. I watched Connor's face closely. He was practically vibrating with arrogant anticipation, shifting his weight from foot to foot like a starving animal waiting for a piece of meat. He truly believed that Valerie was about to call his name and invite his fraudulent venture capital firm up to the stage to sign a multi-million-dollar distribution contract. He thought he had successfully scammed his way out of federal prison and secured his place as the savior of my parents' heavily mortgaged estate. Valerie gripped the edges of the podium, and her voice echoed powerfully through the massive speakers. She announced that tonight was not just a celebration of standard corporate growth, but a historic milestone in quantum defense technology. She spoke passionately about the growing threats in global cybersecurity and the desperate need for an uncrackable infrastructure. She explained that their conglomerate had recently finalized the acquisition of a revolutionary proprietary encryption algorithm known as Aegis Core. The moment Valerie said the name of my software, Connor puffed his chest out even further. He aggressively nudged my sister Brianna and loudly whispered that this was his big moment. Brianna beamed with superficial pride, clutching her diamond tennis bracelet, while my father held his phone up high to capture the supposedly triumphant announcement. They were all standing there so incredibly proud and completely blind to the trap that was already snapping shut around their ankles. Valerie continued her speech, her commanding voice demanding absolute attention from the hundreds of elite guests. She stated that acquiring the Aegis Core technology was only a fraction of their ultimate strategic victory. She told the captivated audience that the conglomerate was not simply buying lines of code, but rather they were securing a visionary leader to guide their defense contracts into the next decade. Valerie explained that the brilliant architect who had single-handedly built this quantum algorithm from scratch, in absolute secrecy, had agreed to join their highest executive ranks. Connor frowned slightly, his smug smile faltering for just a fraction of a second. He was expecting to be introduced as the premier distribution partner, not listening to a speech about the algorithm's original creator. He nervously adjusted his collar, glancing around the room as Valerie raised her hand to direct the attention of the crowd. "We are not just acquiring groundbreaking technology tonight," Valerie announced, her voice ringing with undeniable power. "We are gaining a phenomenal mind. This individual has been granted a permanent voting seat on our board of directors and holds the final exclusive signature authority over all vendor contracts and distribution partnerships moving forward." Connor suddenly looked extremely pale. The realization that his supposed guaranteed tech deal was completely dependent on the approval of some unknown new board member visibly shook his fragile ego. Valerie turned her gaze away from the podium and looked directly toward the shadowy area where Trey and I were standing perfectly still. Please join me in welcoming the absolute genius behind Aegis Core, Valerie said, a bright, genuine smile breaking across her strict corporate face. Please welcome our newest board member and the sole architect of our future, Miss Aliyah. The massive primary spotlight instantly swung away from the stage and cut through the darkness of the ballroom. The blinding white beam locked directly onto me and Trey, illuminating my breathtaking custom emerald green silk gown and his flawless tailored suit. The live orchestra immediately began playing a triumphant crescendo, and the entire room erupted into a deafening wave of applause. I stood perfectly straight, my posture radiating absolute dominance and unyielding power. I did not have a limp. I did not look like a broken, pathetic charity case. I looked exactly like the multi-million-dollar tech titan I had quietly become. I slowly turned my head and looked directly at the front row where my family was standing. The physical reaction was immediate and absolutely devastating. The smug, arrogant color instantly violently drained from Connor's face, leaving his skin a sickly, terrifying shade of chalk white. His jaw literally dropped open, his eyes bulging out of his head, as his fragile, fraudulent reality shattered into a million sharp pieces. Brianna dropped her expensive champagne glass, letting it shatter against the polished marble floor, sending expensive liquid splashing across her designer shoes. She was frozen in a state of absolute paralyzing horror, unable to comprehend that the dirty blue-collar grease monkey and the crippled data analyst were currently standing in the center of the most powerful spotlight in the city. My father, Calvin, slowly lowered his smartphone, his hands shaking so violently that he nearly dropped the device. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. My mother, Renee, looked like she had just seen a ghost, her perfectly manicured hands flying up to cover her mouth in sheer breathless shock. They stood there completely paralyzed, realizing in one single crushing moment that the daughter they had mercilessly abandoned to a lifetime of disability was actually the billionaire architect who completely controlled their entire financial existence. The entire ballroom was dead silent as I took my first step toward the glowing stage. I did not drag my right foot. I did not hesitate or falter for a single fraction of a second. My posture was perfectly straight, and my gait was completely flawless. The heavy emerald green silk of my custom gown flowed around my legs like liquid glass with every confident stride I took. The rhythmic clicking of my red bottom heels against the polished marble floor echoed loudly through the massive space. I walked right past the velvet-roped VIP section where my family was standing frozen in absolute terror. I could physically feel the heat radiating from their panic. I did not even bother to look down at them yet. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Valerie, who was waiting for me at the acrylic podium with a proud, calculating smile. Trey stayed behind, standing tall in the shadows, with his arms crossed over his bespoke suit, watching his older sister claim her rightful throne. I climbed the short set of carpeted stairs leading up to the main platform. The sheer magnitude of the moment settled over me, but it did not make me nervous. It made me feel invincible. Valerie stepped aside, extending her hand to formally present me to the room of billionaires and industry titans. I shook her hand firmly, acknowledging the mutual respect between two ruthless corporate women. I stepped directly up to the center microphone. The bright white spotlight washed over me, illuminating my face for the hundreds of elite guests to see. I placed my hands on the cool edges of the transparent podium and took a slow, deliberate breath. The silence in the room was so thick and heavy that you could hear a pin drop. Every single wealthy investor and tech developer in the building was hanging on to my impending words, waiting to hear from the invisible architect who had revolutionized global digital security. I finally lowered my gaze and looked directly down at the front row where my family was tightly clustered. The visual transformation of their arrogant faces was absolutely spectacular to witness. Connor was sweating so profusely that his slicked back hair was beginning to unspool and stick to his damp forehead. His expensive designer suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for his shrinking, cowardly frame. Brianna was physically shaking her hands, clutching her useless diamond necklace as if it could somehow protect her from the impending devastation. My mother, Renee, was clutching her chest, taking shallow, panicked breaths while her entire socialite facade actively dissolved into pure naked fear. My father Calvin looked like he was about to pass out. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, staring up at me as if I was a terrifying alien creature he had never seen before. They were completely trapped with absolutely nowhere to run. I leaned closely into the microphone and let my voice carry through the massive speakers lining the walls. I thanked Valerie for the incredibly warm introduction and expressed my profound gratitude to the entire executive board for welcoming me into their corporate family. My voice was smooth and melodic, showing no trace of the broken, disabled woman my parents thought I was. I told the audience that building the Aegis Core algorithm had been the defining journey of my professional life. I explained that securing the future of global digital infrastructure required not just brilliant engineering, but also an unwavering commitment to absolute transparency and unyielding corporate integrity. The tech executives in the room nodded in solemn agreement, captivated by my speech. I slowly shifted my full attention directly onto Connor. I smiled a warm, beautiful fake smile that was laced with pure lethal poison. I told the captivated audience that tonight was supposed to be a momentous evening for more than just my induction into the conglomerate. I announced that our board of directors had originally planned to publicly sign a massive multi-million-dollar software distribution deal tonight. I gestured gracefully with my hand pointing right at my sweating brother-in-law. I stated clearly that the distribution partnership was intended to be awarded to Vanguard Venture Capital, which was directed by the man standing right in the front row, Mr. Connor. The spotlight immediately widened to include Connor in its blinding beam. Several wealthy investors sitting at the nearby tables began to politely clap, assuming this was a standard celebratory introduction. Connor desperately tried to play along with the corporate charade. He forced a terrible shaky smile onto his pale face and weakly raised his hand to acknowledge the scattered applause. He was visibly trembling, trying to mentally convince himself that I was just playing a dramatic game and that he was still going to get the life-saving contract. He swallowed hard, tugging at his tight collar, begging me with his wide, terrified eyes to just sign the papers and let him walk away with his fraudulent dignity intact. He looked so incredibly small and pathetic, standing there begging for mercy from the very same woman he had mocked and discarded in a sterile hospital room. I let the polite applause completely die down before I spoke again. The warm, pleasant tone entirely vanished from my voice. It was instantly replaced by a cold, cutting sheet of pure ice that lowered the temperature of the entire ballroom. I leaned closer to the microphone and stated that unfortunately, a major complication had arisen during the final stages of the partnership approval process. I explained that as the newest executive board member holding the ultimate signature authority over all vendor contracts, I felt a deep personal obligation to conduct my own rigorous independent due diligence. I told the crowd that I could not simply hand over our most valuable defense technology to an external firm without personally verifying the absolute structural integrity of their internal financial operations. My eyes bored a hole straight through Connor's skull. I stated loud and clear that after performing a highly specialized backdoor audit of his private venture capital servers, I uncovered several deeply concerning irregularities. Connor let out a quiet, desperate gasp that was barely audible over the low murmur beginning to spread through the crowd. I did not hesitate or soften the blow. I told the hundreds of elite guests that I absolutely do not sign corporate distribution contracts with fraudulent funds operating as active illegal Ponzi schemes. The entire massive ballroom gasped in a single collective breath of pure, unadulterated shock. The deafening silence was instantly shattered by an explosive wave of frantic whispering and shocked exclamations. The wealthy tech investors who had been standing near Connor immediately took several large steps away from him, treating him like he carried a highly contagious, deadly disease. Their faces twisted from polite interest into expressions of profound corporate disgust and furious alarm. Connor threw his hands up in the air, wildly, shaking his head and trying to mouth the word "no" to the surrounding executives, but his voice was completely lost in the escalating chaos. His entire fraudulent empire had just been violently ripped open and exposed under the brightest possible lights in front of every major financial player in the city. I did not give the room a single second to recover from the initial shock of my true identity. The microphone easily picked up the sharp intake of breath from the front row, where Connor was currently suffocating under the crushing weight of his own lies. I leaned closer to the acrylic podium, letting my voice echo with absolute clinical precision. I told the crowd of elite investors that when I conducted my routine security sweep of Vanguard Venture Capital, I fully expected to find standard corporate discrepancies or minor accounting errors. Instead, I found a meticulously constructed graveyard of stolen funds and shattered livelihoods. I looked directly into Connor's terrified eyes and stated that his entire corporate portfolio was completely fabricated from the ground up. I explained to the completely silent ballroom that Vanguard Venture Capital had not turned a legitimate profit in over 3 calendar years. The firm was dead, and Connor was just using naive investors to prop up the rotting corpse. The wealthy executives in the room began murmuring loudly, their faces twisting from polite shock into deep, furious concern. I raised my hand gracefully to command their attention back to the stage. I did not soften my tone or look away from my paralyzed family. I announced clearly that Connor was running a desperate and highly illegal Ponzi scheme right under their noses. I told the audience that he was systematically siphoning cash from brand new naive investors just to quietly pay off the massive bleeding deficits of his older angry clients. A sharp collective gasp rippled through the sea of expensive silk and tailored tuxedos. I watched Connor's knees visibly buckle his expensive tailored suit, practically swallowing his shrinking, cowardly frame. He tried to shake his head to deny the accusations, but he could not find the breath to speak. I was not finished tearing his fake empire apart. I gripped the edges of the transparent podium and prepared to deliver the ultimate death blow to my greedy parents. I stated that just 2 days before my traumatic car accident, Connor had actively targeted his own family to keep his sinking ship afloat. I looked right at my father Calvin, whose face was already a mask of pure sweating horror. I spoke loudly, ensuring every single member of Atlanta high society heard me clearly. I announced that Connor had manipulated his father-in-law to secretly remortgage his historic generational family estate. I revealed the exact numbers, telling the crowd that Connor had taken $1.5 million of stolen equity from his wife's parents just to illegally cover his catastrophic trading losses on the stock market. The color drained from my mother's face as the whispers in the room grew into a deafening roar. I delivered the final nail in the coffin with a cold, detached smile. I told the room that I had already compiled every single fraudulent ledger, fake prospectus, and illegal offshore wire transfer receipt. I proudly informed the audience that I had securely forwarded the entire unredacted digital package directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission for federal investigation. The elegant corporate gala instantaneously descended into absolute primal chaos. The wealthy tech investors who had been standing next to Connor violently shoved themselves away from him as if he was entirely covered in a highly contagious disease. The sharp sound of breaking glass shattered the heavy tension. My father Calvin dropped his expensive crystal champagne flute directly onto the polished marble floor. The grand illusion of his elite wealthy status completely evaporated in a single violent heartbeat. Calvin let out a raw, guttural scream that tore through the sophisticated ballroom. He lunged forward with terrifying speed, grabbing Connor violently by the lapels of his custom designer suit. My father shoved his white son-in-law hard against the solid edge of the stage, shaking him like a lifeless rag doll. "My house!" Calvin roared, his voice cracking with pure absolute desperation. "You took the equity out of my historic family house. Where is my money, Connor? Where is the $1.5 million you promised me?" Connor could not even form a coherent sentence. He just stammered and choked, trying desperately to pry my father's furious hands off his throat, while tears of pure cowardice streamed down his pale, sweating face. "My golden child," Brianna finally snapped out of her paralyzing mental shock. The devastating realization that she was not a wealthy venture capitalist wife, but rather the broke spouse of a federal criminal, completely broke her fragile mind. She let out a hysterical, piercing shriek that completely drowned out the live jazz orchestra. Brianna lunged at her husband, her perfectly manicured hands transforming into weapons. She started viciously slapping Connor's chest and shoulders, screaming that he had ruined her life and destroyed her perfect socialite reputation forever. She wailed loudly about her Maldives vacation and her luxury sports cars, realizing in real time that the federal government was about to seize every single thing she claimed to own. Right beside that violent struggle, my mother, Renee, simply collapsed. Her knees completely gave out and she sank heavily to the cold marble floor in her expensive designer gown. The flawless elite facade she had spent decades meticulously building among the Jack and Jill alumni was permanently obliterated in front of the exact people she wanted to impress. The same wealthy women she used to judge and look down upon were currently staring at her with profound pity and deep disgust. Rennie covered her face with her shaking hands and began weeping uncontrollably, mourning the immediate absolute death of her social status. She was no longer a wealthy matriarch, but just another foolish victim of a massive financial scam. The massive wooden doors at the back of the ballroom suddenly burst open. A highly trained team of private corporate security guards, wearing dark suits and earpieces, flooded into the room to regain control of the violent situation. They rushed down the center aisle, moving swiftly toward the absolute disaster unfolding in the VIP section. The security team had to physically pry my screaming father off of Connor. Calvin fought against the strong guards, kicking and yelling about his stolen generational home, while tears streamed down his flushed, angry face. Brianna was physically restrained by two female security officers, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the bright stage lights as she thrashed and sobbed in sheer humiliation. Connor simply collapsed onto his knees on the marble floor, wrapping his arms around his head like a frightened child, as the guards formed a tight protective perimeter around him. The wealthy investors in the crowd were already pulling out their phones, frantically dialing their private wealth managers and defense attorneys to ensure their own funds were not tied up in Connor's toxic web. I stood perfectly still on the stage, watching the absolute destruction of the people who had casually abandoned me to a lifetime of pain. I looked over at Trey, who was standing safely in the shadows, watching the chaotic scene with wide, disbelieving eyes. The elaborate trap I had carefully set months ago had snapped shut flawlessly, and there was absolutely no escape for any of them. The heavy wooden doors of the ballroom swung open again, but this time it was not security guards who entered. It was four uniformed federal agents flanked by local Atlanta police officers. The red and blue flashing lights from their cruisers illuminated the frosted glass windows of the Four Seasons Hotel, casting a frantic strobe effect across the terrified faces of the elite guests. The agents moved with swift military precision, cutting straight through the crowd of panicked billionaires directly toward the VIP section, where Connor was still kneeling on the marble floor. One of the agents pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt and roughly grabbed Connor's arms, forcing them behind his back. Connor did not even try to fight or resist the arrest. His entire body was completely limp, his expensive designer suit now wrinkled and soaked in his own cold sweat as they read him his rights regarding massive federal wire fraud and illegal securities manipulation. The wealthy investors who had previously praised him were now actively taking photos and recording his humiliating downfall on their phones to distance themselves from his toxic criminal enterprise. My older sister, Brianna, was screaming uncontrollably as she watched her arrogant husband being physically dragged away by law enforcement. She clawed at the security guards holding her back, her perfect hair completely ruined, and her mascara running down her cheeks in dark, thick streaks. She wailed about her frozen bank accounts and her impending social ruin, completely ignoring the fact that her husband was facing decades in a federal penitentiary. The sheer pathetic nature of her breakdown was almost difficult to watch, but I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the woman who had mercilessly mocked my shattered leg just a few months ago. Down below the stage, my parents were experiencing their own horrific mental collapse. Calvin and Renee had completely lost every single ounce of their carefully cultivated upper-class dignity. My father, whose entire identity was built on country club memberships and projecting financial dominance, was actively shoving his way past the private security perimeter. He grabbed my mother by the hand and violently pulled her toward the acrylic podium where I was standing. The two of them looked absolutely deranged. Calvin's custom silk tie was torn, and his breathing was heavy and erratic. Renee had lost one of her expensive diamond earrings in the scuffle, and her flawless socialite posture was replaced by the desperate, frantic scrambling of a cornered animal. They hit the base of the carpeted stage and looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. The sheer audacity of what happened next truly solidified exactly how deeply broken and toxic my parents were. Instead of apologizing for abandoning me in the hospital, or showing any remorse for leveraging their generational home to fund a criminal, they instantly reverted to their greedy, manipulative nature. Calvin slapped his hands against the edge of the stage, leaving sweaty palm prints on the pristine surface. He looked up at my custom emerald gown and the heavy titanium board member credential hanging from my clutch. His voice was hoarse and cracking with pure panic as he yelled up to me, telling me that I was a multimillionaire now and that I had more than enough liquid capital to fix this disaster. He demanded that I immediately wire $1.5 million to the bank to pay off the predatory secondary mortgage and save the historic family estate from immediate foreclosure. Renee grabbed the edge of the stage right next to him, her face a twisted mask of desperate tears and extreme entitlement. She begged me to listen to my father sobbing loudly that we were blood relatives and that family must always stick together during times of financial crisis. She cried that they would completely lose their standing in the Jack and Jill Alumni Association and that their high society friends would completely shun them if they lost the mansion. She reached her shaking, manicured hand up toward my ankles, practically demanding that I use my new, immense wealth to bail them out of the exact same catastrophic mess they had eagerly created. They genuinely believed that my $18 million fortune was simply an emergency slush fund for their own vain, superficial mistakes. I stood perfectly still at the center of the stage, looking down at the two people who had given me life, but had never given me a single drop of actual, unconditional love. I felt absolutely zero emotional connection to their frantic, desperate wails. The deep, agonizing wounds they had inflicted on me throughout my entire life had completely scarred over, leaving behind an impenetrable shield of pure, absolute detachment. I did not feel angry anymore. I did not feel sad. I simply looked at them, the same way one might look at a piece of trash blowing across a dirty city sidewalk. I slowly leaned forward, bringing my mouth just inches away from the active microphone resting on the transparent podium. The ballroom was still quiet enough for my voice to echo with crystal-clear, devastating precision. I looked directly into my father's bloodshot, panicked eyes, and I spoke in a smooth, deadpan tone. I told him I simply do not have that kind of money just lying around for his sudden financial emergencies. Calvin's mouth dropped open in sheer shock, recognizing the exact cruel phrase he had used to deny my life-saving medical deposit. I shifted my cold gaze to my weeping mother, watching her tears ruin her expensive designer makeup. I offered her a tight, emotionless smile and told her that I genuinely think a brutal foreclosure will finally teach her some real responsibility. I added that losing everything she owns will serve as a wonderful daily reminder that her poor, selfish actions have highly devastating consequences. The absolute profound silence that followed my words was the sweetest sound I had ever heard in my entire life. My parents were completely physically paralyzed by the staggering weight of their own regurgitated cruelty. They stared up at me with open mouths, unable to comprehend that the disabled daughter they had mercilessly discarded was now officially executing their total financial ruin without a single shred of mercy or hesitation. I did not wait for them to find their voices or offer any more pathetic, manipulative excuses. I simply took a slow, deliberate step back from the acrylic podium and turned my back on them completely. The sound of their desperate, agonizing wails eventually erupted behind me, but I tuned the noise out entirely. I walked gracefully across the wide, illuminated stage, my emerald silk gown trailing beautifully behind me as I moved toward the dark, quiet shadows of the side exit, leaving them to drown in the shallow, miserable world they had built for themselves. I descended the short flight of carpeted stairs, leading off the side of the main stage, leaving the blinding heat of the spotlight behind me. The chaotic symphony of my parents screaming and the federal agents shouting commands faded into a muffled roar as I stepped into the heavy shadows of the backstage area. Trey was standing exactly where I had left him. His tall frame was rigid inside his bespoke midnight blue suit, and his hands were clenched tightly at his sides. He was staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes, as if I had just descended from another planet. He had watched his quiet, disabled sister single-handedly obliterate the most powerful people in our family with ruthless precision. I walked up to him and gently placed my hand on his forearm, feeling the tense, rigid muscles beneath the expensive wool fabric. I did not say a word to him yet. I simply tightened my grip and gently pulled him away from the heavy velvet curtains separating us from the collapsing gala. I guided my brother down a long carpeted service corridor that ran parallel to the main ballroom, safely away from the flashing police lights and the frantic, wealthy investors. We navigated through a set of heavy soundproof double doors and stepped into a highly exclusive private VIP lounge reserved for the hotel executives. The atmosphere inside the room was a jarring contrast to the absolute warfare taking place just down the hall. The lounge was perfectly still and deeply quiet, bathed in the soft, warm glow of recessed amber lighting. Thick mahogany bookshelves lined the walls, and the air smelled faintly of expensive cedar and polished leather. I released Trey's arm and let the heavy doors click shut behind us, completely sealing us off from the destruction of our toxic family. Trey took a few slow, unsteady steps into the center of the plush room, looking around in a state of profound sensory overload. He finally turned to face me, his dark eyes searching my face for any trace of the sister he thought he knew. He took a shaky breath, and his voice cracked perfectly in the quiet space as he asked me if any of this was actually real. The cold, impenetrable armor I had worn all evening instantly melted away. The ruthless corporate titan vanished, leaving only a sister standing in front of her beloved brother. For the very first time since the horrific night of my car accident, hot, genuine tears welled up in my eyes and spilled over my eyelashes. I smiled at him, a deeply radiant and entirely authentic smile that made my cheeks ache. I reached over to the heavy polished oak table in the center of the room, where I had previously instructed security to leave a specific item for me. I picked up a thick, heavy portfolio made of premium black leather and held it out toward my brother. Trey stared at the leather folder with profound hesitation, as if it might physically burn him if he touched it. I stepped closer and gently pressed the heavy portfolio directly against his chest, forcing his hands to instinctively come up and grasp the edges. I looked deep into his exhausted, tear-filled eyes and spoke with a voice completely stripped of any corporate malice. I told Trey that exactly 8 months ago he had sprinted into a sterile hospital room covered in dark engine grease and pressed 700 crumpled dollars into my hands. I reminded him that he had voluntarily pawned his entire livelihood and sold his most vital diagnostic tools just to save my right leg from permanent paralysis. I watched the memory of that desperate night flash across Trey's face as I told him that I had promised to find a way to pay him back. I nodded down at the black leather portfolio in his trembling hands and quietly instructed him to open it. Trey slowly peeled back the heavy cover, revealing a thick stack of crisp legal documents stamped with official state seals and corporate watermarks. He stared blankly at the bold typed words on the first page, struggling to comprehend the massive legal terminology. I did not make him guess. I softly explained that the documents he was holding were the absolute undisputed deed and the full uncompromising ownership papers to a commercial entity known as Apex Auto Restoration. Trey's breath hitched audibly in his throat. Every single mechanic in the state of Georgia knew the name Apex Auto. It was not just a simple garage. It was the largest, most elite and heavily guarded chain of luxury automotive restoration centers in the entire southern region. It boasted 12 sprawling locations, outfitted with absolute state-of-the-art hydraulic bays, pristine climate-controlled paint booths, and highly exclusive diagnostic centers catering solely to exotic imported sports cars. Trey's hands began to shake violently as his eyes darted across the official transfer of ownership contracts. He saw his own full legal name printed flawlessly in bold black ink, listed as the sole proprietor and absolute chief executive officer of the entire multi-million-dollar franchise. I stepped closer and told my brother that I did not just buy his stolen diagnostic scanners back from the pawn shop. I told him that I bought him an entire untouchable empire. I explained that our arrogant parents and our vicious sister had spent his entire life mocking his blue-collar passion, treating him like a dirty grease monkey and a humiliating family failure. I told him that starting tomorrow morning, he would be the supreme executive employer of over 200 highly skilled master mechanics, and that his corporate net worth now vastly exceeded the pathetic fraudulent wealth Connor had ever pretended to possess. The sheer magnitude of the absolute financial fortress I had just handed him finally crashed over Trey's mind. The heavy leather portfolio slipped slightly in his grasp as his knees buckled under the profound emotional weight of his new reality. Trey let out a raw, agonizing sob that tore straight up from the deepest part of his chest. It was the heavy, unfiltered sound of decades of emotional abuse, systemic family rejection, and relentless financial struggle, finally breaking wide open and leaving his body forever. The thick defensive walls he had built to survive our parents' toxic favoritism completely shattered into dust. He dropped his head forward, and the tears flowed freely down his face, spotting the pristine lapels of his bespoke midnight blue suit. I closed the small physical distance between us and wrapped my arms tightly around his broad, shaking shoulders. Trey immediately dropped his face into the soft emerald silk of my custom gown, hugging me back with a fierce, desperate strength that nearly knocked the breath out of my lungs. We stood there in the center of the quiet, warm mahogany lounge, holding on to each other while the muffled, chaotic sounds of our parents losing absolutely everything played like distant background music outside the heavy doors. We cried together, not out of grief or sorrow, but out of sheer, profound relief. The toxic generational curse that had bound us to a life of misery and conditional love had been permanently, violently severed. I held my brother tightly, feeling the powerful, steady rhythm of his heart beating against mine, knowing with absolute certainty that no one in this world would ever be able to look down on us again. Exactly 365 days have passed since the night I shattered the fragile glass house my family called a legacy. I am currently standing in front of the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my brand-new corporate headquarters, located in the very center of the Midtown Atlanta skyline. The morning sun is reflecting off the thick, tempered glass, warming my skin as I look down at the sprawling city moving far below my feet. I am wearing a flawlessly tailored dark plum suit cut specifically to complement my strong, steady stance. I am not leaning on a cane, and I do not favor my right side. My stride is completely perfect, a silent testament to the elite medical reconstruction I purchased and the relentless physical therapy I conquered. My position on the executive board of the global tech conglomerate has only solidified over the past year. Aegis Core is now the absolute industry standard for international cybersecurity defense networks, and my personal net worth has organically multiplied far beyond my initial $18 million buyout. I am standing at the absolute pinnacle of the corporate world, looking down at the scattered ashes of the people who tried to leave me crippled in a sterile hospital bed. The natural consequences of my actions rippled through the Georgia legal system with devastating efficiency. Connor is currently serving a 15-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary for massive wire fraud and illegal securities manipulation. His arrogant finance bro persona was completely stripped away the second the judge slammed the heavy wooden gavel down on his desk. There are no more custom Italian suits or exclusive country club dinners for him. He wears a bright orange generic prison uniform and spends his highly regulated days mopping the sticky concrete floors of a loud prison cafeteria. He is surrounded by the exact type of violent, aggressive criminals he used to mock from his ivory tower. His arrogant venture capital firm was entirely liquidated by the federal government to pay back a tiny fraction of the millions he stole from his naive investors. He has absolutely nothing left to his name. My older sister, Brianna, experienced a terrifying fall from grace that completely shattered her fragile narcissistic reality. Without Connor's fraudulent bank accounts to fund her excessive lifestyle, her shallow high society friends instantly abandoned her. She was completely excommunicated from the elite circles of the Atlanta upper class. She lost the luxury cars, the designer handbags, and the private tropical vacations. Brianna is currently working a grueling minimum wage retail job at a discount clothing store in a dying suburban shopping mall. The former golden child, who used to strut through the hospital in cashmere, mocking my shattered leg, now spends 8 hours a day standing on her aching feet. She is forced to fold cheap polyester shirts for rude, aggressive customers who do not care about her past status. She lives in a tiny rented room and takes the public city bus to work every single morning, entirely stripped of the unearned privilege she once weaponized against me. The devastation my parents faced was even more profound because they actively chose to sacrifice their entire generational legacy for a cheap illusion of status. The bank swiftly foreclosed on the historic family mansion. The pristine property that my great-grandfather built from the dirt up was publicly auctioned off to the highest bidder to cover the massive predatory loan they took out for Connor. The luxury yacht my father Calvin bragged about buying, while I was bleeding in the emergency room, was immediately repossessed by the dealership before it even touched the water. Calvin and Renee now live in a cramped, damp two-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. The walls are incredibly thin and the cheap plumbing constantly leaks. They have no assets and no future. My mother Renee attempted to attend a local charity luncheon just a few months after the scandal broke, desperately trying to cling to her prestigious Jack and Jill alumni status. The wealthy women at the event completely ignored her, refusing to even make eye contact. She was politely but firmly asked to leave the upscale venue by the event organizers. She now spends her long, lonely days sitting in her tiny, dark living room, staring at the peeling wallpaper, mourning the absolute death of her social relevance. Calvin is a hollow, broken shell of a man. The heavy gold Rolex is gone, replaced by a cheap plastic digital watch. He lost his entire identity the moment his bank accounts were permanently frozen. They are complete ghosts haunting a city they used to believe they owned. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum, my younger brother Trey is absolutely thriving. Giving him the deed to the Apex Auto Restoration empire was the absolute best investment I have ever made in my entire life. Trey completely transformed the already highly successful franchise into a dominant automotive powerhouse. He is a brilliant chief executive officer who treats his mechanics with the profound, deep respect our parents never ever showed him. Just yesterday morning, I attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony for his newest high-tech garage location downtown. He was wearing a sharp tailored suit, proudly announcing to the local press that he had just officially hired his 50th full-time employee. Despite his massive multi-million-dollar success, Trey still loves to put on a pair of clean coveralls and get under the hood of a classic muscle car. His dark eyes are full of bright, genuine joy, and the bond we share as siblings is completely unbreakable. We built our own powerful family from the toxic wreckage of the old one. I turn away from the breathtaking view of the Atlanta skyline and walk back toward my massive glass desk. My executive assistant has already laid out the final vendor contracts requiring my signature for the afternoon. I sit down in my high-back leather chair and pick up my heavy silver fountain pen. I think about the dark, rainy night in the emergency room when my parents and my sister walked out the door and left me to face a lifetime of chronic pain. They genuinely thought that denying me financial help would permanently break my spirit. They honestly thought that prioritizing their shallow vanity over my basic physical ability to walk would keep me trapped securely beneath their expensive designer shoes forever. They wanted me to stay small and broken, so they could feel incredibly tall and powerful in their fake world. But when you mercilessly cut off a strong woman's legs, she does not just learn how to quietly limp through the pain. She learns exactly how to build herself a brand new set of wings, and she learns how to fly. I did not just walk away from my toxic family on the night of that corporate gala. I soared right over their heads, leaving them trapped in the dirt while I claimed the entire sky. The black ink flows smoothly onto the thick paper contract as I sign my name, sealing another massive strategic victory for my corporate empire. I set the heavy pen down and lean back in my soft leather chair, letting a slow, triumphant smile spread across my face as the warm morning light fills the room and the scene fades to a quiet, peaceful black.